The voice came like thunder wrapped in whispers, not the kind of divine communication Hosea had imagined during his years of faithful service. Not a vision of angels or a dream filled with symbolic imagery. Just words. Clear, unmistakable, impossible to misunderstand. Go, marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her, for like an adulterous wife this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord. Hosea stood frozen in the stillness of early morning. The command hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. Around him the world continued its ordinary rhythm. Birds sang their dawn chorus. Merchants prepared their goods for market. Farmers headed toward fields that stretched across the fertile valleys of Israel. But for Hosea, everything had stopped. God had just commanded him to do the unthinkable. Marry a prostitute, not metaphorically, not as a parable to be told from a safe distance. Actually marry her, build a life with her, have children with her. Let his reputation, his ministry, his entire future be bound to a woman whose very presence would make respectable people cross to the other side of the street. The scandal wasn't just social, it was theological. Priests couldn't marry prostitutes. That was established law, written clearly in the sacred texts. Even common Israelites avoided such unions. The children would be considered illegitimate. The family would be marked. Every gathering, every festival, every moment of public life would carry the weight of whispered judgments and sideways glances. Yet here stood God's command, as real as the ground beneath his feet, as undeniable as his own heartbeat. Hosea's mind raced through possibilities. Perhaps he had misheard. Perhaps this was a test of his willingness to obey, and God would provide a substitute at the last moment, like the ram in the thicket for Abraham. Perhaps the command was symbolic, meant to be acted out in prophecy rather than lived reality. But deep in his spirit, Hosea knew better. The clarity of the divine voice left no room for reinterpretation. This wasn't a riddle or a trick question. This was an assignment that would cost him everything he valued about his standing in the community. His credibility as a prophet would be questioned. His family would be shamed. His message would be dismissed by many simply because of who shared his bed. Before we continue deeper into Hosea's impossible calling, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It helps us keep these in-depth stories of faith, history, and mystery alive. And as always, let us know where in the world you're watching from. This channel has become a global fellowship of seekers, historians, believers, and thinkers united by curiosity. Now take a deep breath and step with me into the pages of time. Why would God command such a thing? The question must have tormented Hosea in those early moments of understanding. What purpose could possibly justify destroying a man's reputation, sabotaging his ministry before it truly began, and creating a family structure that violated every social norm? The answer lay in the parallel. Israel itself had become God's unfaithful wife. The nation that had pledged exclusive devotion to Yahweh at Mount Sinai had turned to other lovers. Foreign gods lined the hilltops, fertility cults flourished in the valleys. The people attributed their prosperity to Baal rather than to the God who had delivered them from Egyptian slavery. They sought security in political alliances with pagan empires rather than trusting in divine protection. Hosea's marriage wouldn't just illustrate this unfaithfulness. It would embody it. Every time someone looked at the prophet with his promiscuous wife, they would see a living picture of Israel's relationship with God. Every moment of pain Hosea experienced through his wife's betrayals would mirror the divine heartbreak over a nation that had abandoned its first love. The command revealed something profound about the nature of God, not a distant cosmic force unconcerned with human affairs, not an abstract principle of justice and law, but a being capable of deep emotional engagement, a God who could be betrayed, a God who experienced the agony of unrequited love, a God whose pain at Israel's unfaithfulness was real enough to require a human prophet to live it out in flesh and blood. 8th century Israel was a nation caught between prosperity and doom. The northern kingdom, separated from Judah for nearly 2 centuries, enjoyed a period of economic expansion. Trade routes flourished. Cities grew. Wealth accumulated in the hands of merchants and landowners. By outward appearances, Israel was thriving. But beneath the surface, rot had set in. The prosperity came with a price. The gap between rich and poor had widened into a chasm. The powerful exploited the vulnerable. Courts could be bought. Justice could be purchased. The religious establishment had grown comfortable, collecting offerings while tolerating the mixing of Yahweh worship with Canaanite practices. Politically, Israel was a puppet kingdom dancing between superpowers. Egypt to the south and Assyria to the north both demanded tribute and allegiance. Israel's kings played dangerous games, making treaties with one empire to guard against the other, switching sides when advantageous, always trying to maintain independence through cunning diplomacy rather than covenant faithfulness. The religious landscape had become thoroughly polluted. High places dotted the countryside, where Israelites worshipped Yahweh alongside Baal and Asherah. They saw no contradiction. These were simply different names for divine forces that controlled fertility, rain, crops, and livestock. Why not hedge your bets? Why not seek blessing from every available source? Temple prostitution flourished as part of fertility worship. The logic seemed sound to ancient agricultural minds. If the gods controlled reproduction in nature, then ritual sexual acts might stimulate divine blessing on fields and flocks. What we now recognize as exploitation and abuse was practiced as religious devotion. This was the world into which Hosea received his shocking command. A world where the lines between faithfulness and adultery had blurred, where covenant loyalty had been replaced by pragmatic spirituality, where the exclusive relationship between Yahweh and Israel had been diluted into just another option among many religious choices. Hosea himself came from this world. He wasn't an outsider looking in with easy judgment. He knew the pressures that led people toward compromise. He understood the economic arguments for political alliances. He had grown up in a culture where mixed worship seemed normal, where everyone participated in practices that earlier generations would have recognized as apostasy. Yet God had called him to be a prophet, to speak truth that would make him unpopular, to live a life that would illustrate uncomfortable realities, and now to marry in a way that would make his entire existence a walking sermon that most people would refuse to hear. The woman's name was Gomer, daughter of Diblaim. The text preserves even her father's name, as if to emphasize that this wasn't allegory or fiction. This was a real woman with a real family and a real history, a woman whose life choices had led her into prostitution, a woman whose past would never be forgotten by the community that knew her story. What must have gone through Gomer's mind when Hosea came to her with his proposal? A prophet wanted to marry her, not in secret, not as a way to quietly rescue her from her circumstances, but openly, publicly, making their union a matter of public record and prophetic declaration. Did she understand what was being asked of her? Did she grasp that her life was about to become a living parable? Or did she simply see an opportunity to escape her current situation, to gain the security and respectability that marriage offered, even if that marriage came with strange conditions and stranger purposes? The command to marry Gomer was just the beginning. Hosea would soon learn that obedience to God sometimes means embracing circumstances that make no sense by human logic, that faithfulness can require walking a path that looks like foolishness to everyone watching, that love, divine or human, sometimes demands the kind of commitment that appears absurd to those who haven't glimpsed the deeper purpose behind apparent madness. As Hosea moved toward fulfilling God's command, he stepped into a story that would span years of personal anguish and prophetic revelation. A story where his pain would preach louder than his words, where his family would become God's visual aid to a nation too blind to see its own spiritual adultery, where the scandal of his marriage would pale compared to the scandal of divine grace pursuing an unfaithful people who deserved nothing but judgment. The shocking command had been given. Now came the even more shocking journey of living it out. To understand why God would use such a drastic object lesson, we must first understand the fractured world in which Hosea lived. This wasn't the united Israel of David and Solomon's golden age. That dream had shattered nearly 2 centuries before Hosea's birth, broken apart by pride, taxation, and the arrogance of a foolish king who refused wise counsel. The year was 930 BCE when the kingdom split in 2. King Solomon had died, leaving behind magnificent temples, extensive trade networks, and a population exhausted by forced labor and heavy taxation. His son Rehoboam stood before the northern tribes, who came with a simple request: "Lighten the burden your father placed on us, and we will serve you faithfully." Rehoboam consulted his father's advisors, elderly men who counseled accommodation and gentleness. Then he turned to his young companions, who urged him to show strength and dominance. "My father made your yoke heavy," Rehoboam declared to the waiting tribes. "I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." The northern tribes walked away that day and never came back. 10 tribes formed the northern kingdom, keeping the name Israel and establishing their capital eventually in Samaria. 2 tribes remained loyal to David's lineage, forming Judah in the south with Jerusalem as their center. What God had joined together through covenant and promise, human foolishness had torn apart. By Hosea's time in the mid-8th century BCE, this division had become permanent reality. Israel and Judah weren't just separate nations. They were sometimes enemies, occasionally allies, always rivals. The split wasn't merely political. It carried deep theological implications that shaped everything that followed. Jerusalem held the temple, the priesthood, the Ark of the Covenant, and the promise that a son of David would always sit on the throne. Judah possessed the tangible symbols of divine presence and covenant continuity. The northern tribes had walked away from all of this when they chose independence. But Israel's first king, Jeroboam, recognized a problem immediately. If his people continued traveling to Jerusalem for the major festivals, their hearts might turn back toward the southern kingdom. So he did something that would echo through generations as the defining sin of northern Israel. He set up golden calves at Dan in the north and Bethel in the south, declaring, "Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." These weren't meant to be other gods, at least not initially. They were supposed to represent Yahweh, visible symbols of divine presence like the cherubim in Jerusalem's temple. But the distinction between representation and reality blurred almost immediately. What began as political pragmatism became spiritual poison that would contaminate the northern kingdom throughout its entire existence. Every king of Israel who followed would be measured against this original sin. The repeated refrain in the historical records cuts like a knife. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the sins of Jeroboam, which he had caused Israel to commit. Generation after generation, king after king, the pattern held. The golden calves remained. The worship of Yahweh mixed with Canaanite practices. The covenant slowly dissolved into syncretism. Political instability plagued the northern kingdom from its inception. While Judah maintained an unbroken line of Davidic kings, Israel cycled through 9 different dynasties in just over 200 years. 20 kings ruled during this period, and few died peacefully in their beds. Assassination, Coup and conspiracy became the normal path to power. In Hosea's own lifetime, the chaos reached a crescendo. King Zechariah, son of Jeroboam II, ruled for merely 6 months before Shallum murdered him publicly. Shallum himself lasted only 1 month before Menahem killed him and seized the throne. Menahem ruled for 10 brutal years, maintaining power through extreme violence and heavy taxation to pay tribute to Assyria. His son Pekahiah managed 2 years before his own officer Pekah assassinated him. Pekah ruled for 20 years before Hosea conspired against him and became Israel's final king. This was the political reality surrounding Hosea's ministry. Thrones changed hands through violence. Loyalty shifted like desert sand. No one trusted anyone. Prophets who spoke truth risked execution. Stability was a distant memory if it had ever existed at all. Yet paradoxically, this period of political chaos coincided with remarkable economic prosperity. Under Jeroboam II, Israel's territory expanded to its greatest extent since Solomon's time. Trade flourished, cities grew, agricultural production increased, merchants accumulated wealth, new construction changed skylines. The rich lived in houses adorned with ivory inlays, a luxury imported from distant lands. They reclined on comfortable couches while musicians played. They hosted elaborate banquets featuring choice foods and expensive wines. The prophets Amos and Hosea both described this lifestyle with biting critique, seeing not prosperity but moral decay dressed in fine clothing. Meanwhile, the poor grew poorer. Land ownership concentrated in fewer hands as debt forced small farmers to sell their ancestral inheritances. Courts favored those who could afford bribes. The powerful trampled the vulnerable without consequence. The economic boom created a society where the gap between haves and have-nots yawned wider with each passing year. Religious life reflected this corruption. Temples thrived, their coffers full from offerings brought by prosperous worshippers who felt their wealth proved divine blessing. Sacrifices were offered in abundance. Festivals were celebrated with enthusiasm. But justice, mercy, and faithfulness, the actual requirements of covenant relationship, had been abandoned. The prophet Amos, Hosea's contemporary, captured this disconnect perfectly. I despise your religious festivals, God declared through him. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Away with the noise of your songs, I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. Hosea would echo these themes throughout his ministry. Outward religious observance meant nothing when hearts had turned to other lovers. Prosperity was meaningless when achieved through oppression. Peace was an illusion when built on injustice. While Israel's kings played their deadly games of throne and conspiracy, a far greater threat loomed on the horizon. Assyria, the superpower of the ancient Near East, was entering a period of unprecedented expansion and military might. Under aggressive kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Shalmaneser V, Assyrian armies swept across the region, demanding submission and crushing resistance with terrifying efficiency. The Assyrians pioneered psychological warfare through calculated brutality. They recorded their conquests in vivid detail on palace walls and stone monuments, describing how they impaled defeated rulers, skinned rebels alive, and deported entire populations to distant lands. These weren't empty threats. Archaeological evidence confirms the horror. The Assyrians wanted everyone to know what awaited those who resisted their dominance. Israel's kings faced an impossible choice: submit to Assyria and pay crippling tribute that would drain the kingdom's wealth and sovereignty, or resist and face military annihilation. Different rulers chose different paths, often with fatal consequences. Menahem chose submission, paying Tiglath-Pileser 1,000 talents of silver to secure his position. This enormous sum came from taxing every wealthy man in Israel 50 shekels, essentially bleeding the nation to purchase temporary survival. The decision bought time but guaranteed nothing. Later, King Pekah tried the opposite approach. He formed an anti-Assyrian coalition with Syria, attempting to force Judah to join by invading the southern kingdom. This rebellion provoked Assyrian retaliation. Tiglath-Pileser swept down in 732 BCE, conquering the northern and eastern territories of Israel, deporting their populations and reducing the kingdom to a fraction of its former size. Israel's final king, Hosea, initially submitted to Assyria but then secretly negotiated with Egypt, hoping the southern superpower would provide protection. The gamble failed spectacularly. When Assyria discovered the betrayal, King Shalmaneser laid siege to Samaria. The capital held out for 3 years in a desperate defense, but the outcome was never in doubt. In 722 BCE, Samaria fell. The Assyrians deported 27,290 people from the northern kingdom, scattering them across the Assyrian Empire from Mesopotamia to Media. They repopulated the land with foreign peoples, deliberately mixing populations to prevent rebellion. The northern kingdom of Israel ceased to exist as an independent nation. This was the trajectory Hosea witnessed throughout his ministry. He saw the political instability, the economic prosperity built on injustice, the religious corruption disguised as devotion, and the growing Assyrian shadow that would eventually swallow everything. He understood that the nation's political choices reflected deeper spiritual realities. Israel's alliances with foreign powers mirrored its spiritual adultery, seeking security in anything and everything except exclusive covenant relationship with Yahweh. The divided kingdom story was one of progressive betrayal. What began with Rehoboam's foolishness and Jeroboam's compromise had led to centuries of declining faithfulness. The golden calves still stood, the high places still operated, the worship of Yahweh still mixed with Baal veneration. Every generation had drifted further from covenant loyalty until the gap between Israel's calling and Israel's reality had become an unbridgeable chasm. Into this context of political chaos, economic injustice, religious hypocrisy, and looming judgment, God sent Hosea with a message that would be written not just in words, but in the prophet's own life. The shocking command to marry a prostitute was beginning to make terrible sense. Israel itself had become the unfaithful wife, and judgment was coming. The chaos of divided kingdoms and political intrigue formed the backdrop of Hosea's world. But to truly understand his shocking marriage and prophetic message, we must step into the daily rhythms of life in 8th century Israel. This wasn't an abstract theological landscape. It was a world of dust and sweat, of market noise and harvest festivals, of religious rituals performed at dawn and dusk, of families gathered around evening fires sharing bread and stories. Morning in an Israelite town began before sunrise. Farmers rose in darkness to harness oxen for plowing or to lead sheep and goats to grazing lands. Women ground grain between stones, the rhythmic scraping sound marking the start of each day as surely as any rooster's crow. Children fetched water from communal wells where gossip flowed as freely as the water itself. By the time light painted the eastern sky, the day's work was already well underway. The agricultural calendar governed everything. Spring brought barley harvest, a time of intense labor when entire communities worked together to gather crops before weather could destroy them. Summer meant wheat harvest, olive picking, and grape gathering. Autumn saw the early rains return, allowing farmers to plow and plant for the next year. Winter provided a brief respite, though shepherds still tended flocks and craftsmen continued their trades. Towns and villages clustered tightly together, stone houses sharing walls for mutual support and defense. Streets were narrow, barely wide enough for a loaded donkey to pass. Workshops opened directly onto these passages where potters shaped clay, smiths hammered metal. Weavers worked their looms and bakers tended ovens that filled the air with the smell of fresh bread. Markets gathered near town gates where merchants displayed produce, livestock, cloth, pottery, and tools. Here also sat the elders who settled disputes and conducted legal proceedings. Justice was supposed to be administered freely at these gates, but by Hosea's time the system had become thoroughly corrupted. Those with silver could purchase favorable verdicts. The poor found doors closed to their pleas. Religious life wove through daily existence like threads through fabric. The covenant with Yahweh was meant to order everything from agricultural practices to business dealings, from family relationships to treatment of strangers. Specific festivals marked the agricultural year, times when all Israel was supposed to remember their identity as God's chosen people. Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread came in spring, remembering the exodus from Egypt. The Feast of Weeks celebrated the wheat harvest 7 weeks later. The Feast of Tabernacles arrived in autumn, when families built temporary shelters and lived in them for a week, recalling their ancestors' wilderness wandering. These weren't just religious observances, they were the rhythm of national life, connecting present experience with foundational story. But the religious landscape of Hosea's Israel bore little resemblance to the covenant purity these festivals were meant to celebrate. Yahweh worship had become so mixed with Canaanite practices that many Israelites saw no contradiction in serving both. The mixing happened gradually, generation by generation, until the distinction between covenant faithfulness and pagan syncretism had blurred beyond recognition. Baal worship had infiltrated Israelite faith at every level. Baal was the Canaanite storm god, controller of rain and fertility. In agricultural societies utterly dependent on seasonal rains, the appeal was obvious. Yahweh might be the God who delivered ancestors from Egypt, but Baal seemed more immediately relevant to the pressing question of whether crops would flourish or fail. The logic seemed sound to ancient minds. Why not honor both? Why not call on Yahweh for covenant blessings while also seeking Baal's favor for good weather? The Israelites told themselves they weren't abandoning their God, merely supplementing their worship, hedging their spiritual bets in an uncertain world. High places dotted the countryside, outdoor shrines built on hilltops and under sacred trees. These had existed since ancient times, often as places where Yahweh had been worshipped. But by Hosea's era, the distinction between Yahweh shrines and Baal shrines had dissolved. The same location served both, often simultaneously. Stone pillars and wooden Asherah poles stood alongside altars where animals were sacrificed to gods whose identities had merged in worshippers' minds. Even more troubling was the introduction of ritual prostitution. Canaanite fertility religion operated on a principle of sympathetic magic. If divine forces controlled reproduction in nature, then ritual sexual acts might stimulate the gods to bless fields and flocks with abundance. Temple prostitutes, both male and female, served at these shrines. Israelite men participated in these rituals, calling it worship, seeing no betrayal of covenant in acts that amounted to spiritual and physical adultery. The prophets saw this clearly. What the people called wisdom and pragmatism was actually covenant violation of the deepest kind. Israel had pledged exclusive loyalty to Yahweh at Mount Sinai. The covenant was described in marital terms. Israel was Yahweh's bride. Turning to other gods wasn't mere religious pluralism, it was adultery. And participating in ritual prostitution made the metaphor horribly literal. Women brought offerings to Asherah, the Canaanite mother goddess, seeking help with conception and childbirth. Men consulted Baal for favorable weather. Families attributed their prosperity to whichever deity seemed most immediately responsible. Yahweh became just one God among many, perhaps first among equals, but no longer the exclusive object of worship and trust. The official religious establishment had largely accommodated this syncretism. Priests at the Golden Calf shrines in Dan and Bethel conducted services that mixed Yahweh's name with Canaanite practices. They collected offerings and performed sacrifices while tolerating the high places and fertility cults that operated throughout the land. Some priests actively participated in the corruption, enriching themselves through the religious system while abandoning any pretense of covenant faithfulness. Into this spiritually polluted landscape, God continued sending prophets. The prophetic tradition in Israel stretched back to Moses himself, who had spoken face-to-face with God and delivered divine law to a new nation. Samuel had functioned as both prophet and judge, anointing Israel's first kings. Nathan had confronted David's sin. Elijah and Elisha had battled Baal worship in dramatic confrontations with corrupt rulers. But prophets in Hosea's time faced a more subtle challenge. The people still claimed loyalty to Yahweh. They still brought sacrifices and attended festivals. They still used covenant language. The outward forms remained while the inner reality had been gutted. How do you call people back to faithfulness when they insist they're already faithful? How do you expose spiritual adultery when everyone has redefined adultery to exclude their own behavior? Hosea's calling emerged from this impossible situation. He wasn't trained in prophetic schools. He held no official religious position. He came from the northern tribes themselves, understanding their mindset from within rather than judging from outside. Some scholars suggest he may have been a priest, which would make his marriage to a prostitute even more scandalous given priestly purity requirements. But the text remains silent about his background, preserving only his name, his father's name, and the shocking divine command that launched his ministry. The prophetic calling itself was transformative. God didn't merely give Hosea messages to deliver, he gave him a life to live that would become the message. Other prophets performed symbolic acts. Isaiah walked naked and barefoot for 3 years. Jeremiah smashed a clay pot to symbolize coming destruction. Ezekiel lay on his side for hundreds of days and ate bread baked over dung. These were temporary demonstrations, shocking but limited in duration. Hosea's symbolic act would last a lifetime. His marriage to Gomer wasn't a one-time performance. It was an ongoing reality that would shape everything about his existence. Every meal shared with an unfaithful wife, every night sleeping beside her knowing she had been with others, every public appearance where people whispered about his household, every moment of private pain and public shame would preach a sermon about God's relationship with Israel. The genius and horror of this calling lay in its authenticity. Hosea wouldn't be acting. His pain would be real. His humiliation would be genuine. His love for an unfaithful wife would mirror in pale human terms God's incomprehensible love for an unfaithful nation. The prophet's life would become a living parable, his family a walking illustration of divine heartbreak. In a society where prophets were already marginalized and often persecuted, where speaking unwelcome truth could result in imprisonment or death, Hosea received a calling that would make him even more vulnerable. His message would be dismissed not just because it was uncomfortable, but because the messenger himself appeared compromised. How could anyone take seriously a prophet who couldn't even control his own household? What authority did a man with an adulterous wife have to speak about covenant faithfulness? Yet this was precisely the point. Israel's religious leaders, with all their outward respectability and proper credentials, had led the nation into spiritual adultery while maintaining appearances of faithfulness. Hosea, with his scandalous marriage and broken household, would embody the truth they refused to acknowledge. His family's dysfunction would mirror the nation's spiritual reality. His pain would give him authority to speak about God's pain. The prophetic tradition had always demanded courage. Speaking truth to power rarely ended well. But Hosea's calling required a different kind of courage. Not just the bravery to confront kings and priests, but the vulnerability to expose his own deepest wounds as object lessons. Not just the strength to face opposition, but the endurance to live with ongoing humiliation. Not just moments of prophetic boldness, but years of prophetic faithfulness while watching his marriage crumble and his wife return again and again to her lovers. This was the world and the calling that shaped Hosea's ministry. A prosperous nation sliding toward destruction. A religious system that had kept the forms while abandoning the substance. A people who claimed loyalty to Yahweh while serving other gods. And one man commanded to live out in his own flesh the story of divine love pursuing an unfaithful bride who didn't want to be pursued. The stage was set. Now the painful drama would unfold. The divine command had been given, and Hosea now faced the reality of its fulfillment. But who exactly was this woman God had chosen to become the prophet's wife? The text offers us 3 pieces of information, each significant in its own way. Her name was Gomer. She was the daughter of Diblaim, and she was a woman of promiscuity, someone whose sexual history would be known to everyone in the community. Gomer. The name itself carries weight in Hebrew. It comes from a root word meaning completion, or to bring to an end. Some scholars hear in this name a dark irony, a woman whose life choices had brought something to completion, perhaps her own reputation or her family's honor. Others suggest the name might hint at her eventual role in completing God's prophetic message. Names in ancient Israel were never merely labels. They carried meaning, destiny, identity. That she is identified as daughter of Diblaim tells us something important. Her father's name is preserved, suggesting she came from a known family, not from complete anonymity. Diblaim likely means 2 fig cakes, or double-pressed, an unusual name that has puzzled interpreters for centuries. Was this a nickname? A family occupation? A reference to some characteristic or event? The text doesn't explain, leaving us with questions that will never be fully answered. What we do know is that Gomer had a history. The Hebrew term used to describe her, Eshet Zenunim, means literally a woman of whoredoms, or a promiscuous woman. This wasn't casual language. It marked her as someone whose sexual behavior had placed her outside the boundaries of acceptable conduct. Whether this description referred to her past, her present, or her future nature remains a matter of scholarly debate. But the designation was clear enough that everyone would have understood exactly what kind of woman the prophet was being commanded to marry. To understand what this meant for Gomer and for Hosea, we must understand how prostitution functioned in ancient Israelite society. The picture is more complex than modern assumptions might suggest. Prostitution existed in multiple forms, each with different social meanings and implications. Common prostitution operated much as it has in many societies throughout history. Women who had lost family support through widowhood, divorce, or being orphaned sometimes turned to selling sexual access as a means of survival. Tamar in Genesis disguised herself as a prostitute to secure her rights from Judah. Rahab in Jericho ran what appears to have been a commercial establishment. These women existed on society's margins, tolerated but not respected, used but not honored. The law codes addressed prostitution pragmatically. Fathers were forbidden from forcing daughters into prostitution. Men were warned that frequenting prostitutes led to poverty and disgrace. But prostitution itself wasn't outlawed in the way other sexual sins were. It occupied a strange middle space, acknowledged as shameful yet not technically illegal, avoided by respectable people yet woven into the social fabric. Temple prostitution represented something different and far more troubling from a covenant perspective. This was ritual sexual activity conducted as part of Canaanite fertility worship. Both male and female temple prostitutes, called Kadesh and Kadesha in Hebrew, literally holy ones, served at shrines and high places. Their sexual services were understood as sacred acts meant to stimulate divine blessing on crops and livestock. The logic behind this practice ran deep in ancient Near Eastern religion. The gods controlled fertility in nature. Baal's relationship with his consort Anat or Asherah, expressed through storms that brought rain to fertilize the earth, provided the cosmic pattern. Human sexual acts performed in sacred contexts were believed to participate in and encourage this divine fertility. What seems to us like exploitation and abuse was practiced as worship, as a way of aligning earthly activity with heavenly reality. Israelite law strictly forbade this practice. Deuteronomy explicitly commanded that no Israelite woman should become a shrine prostitute, and no Israelite man should become a shrine prostitute either. The earnings from such practices were not to be brought into the house of the Lord, being described as detestable to God. The prohibition couldn't have been clearer. This wasn't merely frowned upon. It was covenant violation of the deepest kind, sexual immorality disguised as religious devotion. Yet by Hosea's time, the practice had become widespread in Israel. The high places functioned openly, with both male and female prostitutes serving at shrines throughout the land. Israelite men participated in these rituals, apparently seeing no contradiction between their covenant identity and their sexual worship of fertility gods. The prophets condemned this constantly, but the practice persisted, deeply embedded in agricultural communities desperate to ensure good harvests. Which type of prostitution described Gomer? The text doesn't specify, leaving room for centuries of interpretation and debate. Was she a common prostitute, a woman who had turned to selling sexual access for economic survival? Or was she a temple prostitute, someone who had served at a shrine, making her sexual activity not just morally questionable but religiously idolatrous? The distinction matters for understanding the full force of Hosea's prophetic sign. If Gomer was a common prostitute, the scandal would be social and moral. A prophet marrying such a woman would shock the community, violating expectations about religious leaders maintaining higher standards of propriety. If she was a temple prostitute, the scandal would be theological as well. A prophet of Yahweh marrying a woman who had sexually served other gods would be not just socially inappropriate but spiritually contaminating. Some interpreters suggest she may have been both, or moved from one to the other. Perhaps she began in temple service and later turned to common prostitution. Perhaps economic desperation led her first to selling sex for survival, and she later became involved in fertility cult practices. The text's silence leaves these questions open, though the parallel to Israel's spiritual condition suggests the religious dimension was significant. What led Gomer to this life? Here we can only speculate, filling in gaps with what we know about women's circumstances in ancient Israel. She may have been widowed young, left without family support in a society that offered few options for women alone. She may have been divorced, bearing the shame and economic vulnerability that came with being a cast-off wife. She may have been orphaned, falling through the social safety net that was supposed to protect the fatherless. Poverty drove many women to prostitution. Without land ownership, without the ability to pursue most trades, without male relatives to provide protection and support, women on the margins had few choices. Prostitution offered survival when other doors had closed. The shame was real, but starvation was more immediate. The social stigma attached to prostitutes in ancient Israel was severe. They were considered ritually unclean, their touch contaminating. Respectable people avoided them. Their children bore the mark of their mother's shame, considered mamzerim, illegitimate offspring excluded from full participation in the community. A prostitute couldn't testify in legal proceedings. Her word was worthless. Her very presence in respectable spaces was unwelcome. Yet Gomer was a real woman with a real story. Behind the label that reduced her to her sexual history stood a person with hopes and fears, with wounds and dreams, with a past that had led her to choices or circumstances that marked her forever in her community's eyes. She had a father whose name is recorded. She presumably had other family members. She had a childhood before prostitution defined her identity. She was someone before she became known as that woman. When Hosea came to her with his proposal, what did she think? Did she see it as escape, a chance to leave, behind a life she hated? Did she view it with suspicion, wondering what kind of man would want a wife with her reputation? Did she understand the prophetic dimension, grasp that her life was about to become a living sermon? Or did she simply accept it as another transaction in a life full of transactions? A man taking her as wife instead of as temporary partner? The text gives us no insight into Gomer's inner world, no record of her words or thoughts. She appears in the story as object rather than subject, someone acted upon rather than acting. This itself reflects the reality of women's lives in patriarchal ancient Israel, where women's voices were rarely preserved and their perspectives rarely centered. But we should resist the temptation to see her merely as a literary device or a theological symbol. She was a person, a woman who lived and breathed, loved and suffered, made choices and faced consequences in a world that offered her few good options. The marriage between Hosea and Gomer would be called many things: a prophetic sign, a living parable, an object lesson about divine love. But before it was any of those things, it was a union between two people, both of whom would be transformed by what came next. Hosea would learn about the pain of loving someone who couldn't remain faithful. Gomer would discover whether a woman with a past could find a future with a man who claimed to love her despite everything she had been and done. Neither of them could have imagined where this path would lead. The scandal of their marriage would be just the beginning. Ahead lay children with terrible names, betrayal that would break Hosea's heart repeatedly, and a redemption story that would challenge everything both of them thought they knew about love, faithfulness, and the possibility of starting over. The woman with a past was about to become the woman at the center of God's message to a nation that refused to listen. The woman with a past was about to become a prophet's wife, and the entire nation would talk about it. Hosea stood at a crossroads that would define the rest of his life. God's command still rang in his ears, clear and unmistakable. Every rational argument screamed against obedience. Every social calculation pointed toward finding some alternative interpretation. But Hosea had learned something about prophetic calling that couldn't be unlearned. When God speaks with that kind of clarity, the only faithful response is obedience, no matter the cost. So he went to Gomer, not in secret, not with shame or hesitation, but openly. He made his intentions known. He followed the proper procedures for betrothal, treating her not as the prostitute everyone knew her to be, but as a woman worthy of honorable marriage. Perhaps family members were involved, negotiating the bride price and marriage covenant. Perhaps witnesses gathered to formalize the agreement. The text gives us no details about these arrangements, but we can imagine the shock rippling through both families and the wider community. Word spread quickly in small towns where everyone knew everyone's business. The prophet Hosea was going to marry Gomer. The man who claimed to speak for Yahweh was taking as his wife a woman known throughout the region for her sexual promiscuity. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when Hosea walked by. Merchants whispered in marketplace corners. Religious leaders shook their heads in disgust. Respectable families made sure their daughters stayed far away from association with such scandal. The wedding itself must have been a surreal event. Traditional Israelite weddings were joyous celebrations lasting 7 days. Families gathered, friends rejoiced, musicians played, wine flowed freely. The bride was adorned in her finest garments, often veiled until the ceremony's culmination. The groom processed through streets with companions, fetching his bride from her father's house and bringing her to her new home. The community participated, blessing the union and celebrating the creation of a new family. But Hosea's wedding carried an additional dimension that transformed celebration into prophetic theater. Every element of the ceremony meant to honor the couple and mark a new beginning, also proclaimed a message to anyone with eyes to see. The prophet was enacting something larger than a personal decision. He was embodying divine truth in flesh and blood, in legal contract and public covenant. Imagine the moment when Hosea stood before witnesses and took Gomer as his wife, speaking the binding words that made them one flesh according to covenant law. Placing upon her the marks of marriage, perhaps a ring or other token that signified she now belonged to him and he to her. The weight of that moment must have pressed upon him with crushing force. He wasn't just marrying a woman with a questionable past. He was binding himself to a living illustration of Israel's relationship with God. Some guests surely attended out of genuine affection for Hosea, supporting him despite their confusion about his choice. Others came out of morbid curiosity, wanting to witness the spectacle of a prophet's fall. Still others stayed away entirely, refusing to associate themselves with such a disgraceful union. Family members may have been torn between loyalty and shame, present in body but distant in spirit. The community reaction went beyond mere gossip. This was scandal that threatened the prophetic office itself. How could Hosea claim to speak for a holy God when his own household violated basic standards of respectability? How could he call Israel to covenant faithfulness when he had married a woman whose life embodied unfaithfulness? The criticism wasn't subtle or quiet. Hosea's authority as a prophet came under immediate attack. Religious leaders were particularly harsh in their judgment. Priests who served at the golden calf shrines, themselves compromised by the syncretism they tolerated, now had a perfect excuse to dismiss anything Hosea might say. They could point to his wife and declare his message invalidated by his personal choices. Never mind that God had commanded the marriage. Never mind that the scandal was precisely the point. They saw only ammunition to use against a prophet whose words made them uncomfortable. For Gomer, the transition from prostitute to prophet's wife must have been jarring. She went from being used by many to belonging to one, from having no legitimate social status to being a married woman with rights and protection under covenant law, from being avoided by respectable society to being thrust into the center of attention, though not in any way she might have hoped. Every eye watched to see if the prostitute could become a proper wife. Every tongue speculated about how long the marriage would last before the prophet realized his mistake. The marriage covenant itself carried profound symbolic weight. In ancient Israel, the covenant between husband and wife mirrored the covenant between Yahweh and Israel. The exclusive sexual relationship between married partners paralleled the exclusive worship relationship God demanded from his people. Adultery in marriage wasn't just personal betrayal. It violated the sacred pattern that marriage was meant to reflect. Hosea's marriage to Gomer made this parallel impossible to ignore. His taking of an unfaithful woman as his wife and pledging himself to her in covenant love became a living picture of God's relationship with Israel. Israel had been unfaithful, had prostituted herself to other gods, had violated every term of the covenant made at Sinai. Yet God continued to claim Israel as his bride, continued to pursue her despite her betrayals, continued to love her with a love that defied all rational calculation. The prophetic act began with the wedding, but extended far beyond that single event. This wasn't a one-time symbolic demonstration that Hosea could complete and move past. This was a life commitment that would unfold over years, each chapter adding new dimensions to the divine message. Hosea's pain would become God's pain. Hosea's humiliation would mirror God's humiliation. Hosea's faithfulness to an unfaithful wife would reflect God's faithfulness to an unfaithful people. In the early days of their marriage, perhaps there was hope. Perhaps Gomer tried to leave her past behind, to build a new life with this man who had chosen her despite everything. Perhaps Hosea allowed himself to imagine that love might be enough to heal old wounds and create something beautiful from broken pieces. Perhaps neighbors began to soften their judgment, thinking maybe the prophet had seen something in this woman that others had missed. But the foundation of their relationship was complicated from the start. Hosea hadn't married Gomer because he fell in love with her beauty or personality, though he may have come to love her genuinely. He married her in obedience to a divine command, to enact a prophetic sign. Gomer hadn't chosen Hosea freely from among many suitors. She had been chosen by God for a purpose she may not have fully understood or desired. Their union began not with romantic love but with prophetic calling. This doesn't mean their relationship lacked real emotion or genuine connection. Hosea's later writings reveal deep pain at Gomer's betrayals, suggesting his feelings for her grew beyond mere duty. The anguish he expressed came from a heart truly broken, not just from a prophet playing a role. Somewhere in the mess of their complicated beginning, real love seems to have taken root, making the betrayals that followed all the more devastating. The symbolic nature of their union meant that Hosea and Gomer's marriage could never be private. Everything they did carried public meaning. Every interaction preached a sermon. Every domestic moment became part of the prophetic message. They lived in a fishbowl where personal life and prophetic ministry blurred into one continuous reality. For Hosea, this must have been exhausting. He couldn't come home and escape from his prophetic role. His wife was his prophetic assignment. His family was his sermon. His pain was his message. Other prophets delivered words and performed symbolic acts, then returned to normal life. Hosea's entire existence became the symbolic act, with no separation between ministry and marriage, no division between prophetic calling and personal experience. For Gomer, living as a prophetic symbol while trying to be an actual person must have created unbearable tension. She wasn't just Hosea's wife. She was that woman everyone talked about, the prostitute turned prophet's wife, the living illustration of Israel's unfaithfulness. Every time she appeared in public, people saw not Gomer the person, but Gomer the symbol. Her past defined her present. Her story belonged not to her, but to God's message. The marriage that shocked the nation had begun. The community had reacted with predictable scandal and judgment. The symbolic dimensions were clear to anyone who cared to see them. But what no one yet knew, including perhaps Hosea and Gomer themselves, was how dark and painful this story would become before any light of redemption could break through. The wedding was just the beginning. The real anguish lay ahead, in children who would bear names of judgment, in betrayals that would break a prophet's heart, and in a love that would prove more stubborn than faithfulness and more enduring than betrayal. The scandal of the wedding would pale compared to the scandal of what came next. But for now, Hosea and Gomer were married, bound by covenant, living out a drama whose full implications neither they nor their audience could yet comprehend. The prophetic marriage had been consummated. Now it would have to be lived. The prophetic marriage had been consummated, and now it would bear fruit in the most painful way imaginable. Children came, as children do in marriages. But these weren't ordinary children given ordinary names that spoke of hope or blessing. These were living prophecies, each one bearing a name that cut like a knife, each one a walking sermon that Israel couldn't ignore. The first child was a son. When Gomer delivered him, God spoke to Hosea again with a command that must have made the prophet's blood run cold. "Call him Jezreel, for I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. In that day I will break Israel's bow in the valley of Jezreel." Jezreel, the name meant God scatters or God sows, but it was the location that carried the real weight. The valley of Jezreel was Israel's breadbasket, a fertile plain stretching across the northern kingdom where countless battles had been fought for control of this strategic and productive land. But Jezreel wasn't just a place. It was a memory soaked in blood. Nearly a century before Hosea's time, a warrior named Jehu had staged a violent coup, slaughtering King Joram in the valley of Jezreel, executing the queen mother Jezebel and massacring 70 sons of the royal house. He wiped out all the prophets and priests and worshippers of Baal he could find, rivers of blood flowing through Jezreel's streets. Jehu claimed divine authorization for his purge, and indeed earlier prophets had declared that judgment would come upon the house of Ahab for their promotion of Baal worship. But Jehu's violence went beyond divine mandate into personal ambition and excessive brutality. He had established his own dynasty through massacre, and now, generations later, God was declaring that blood debt would be repaid. The house of Jehu would fall. The kingdom of Israel itself would be scattered, broken like a bow that could no longer shoot. And every time someone called Hosea's firstborn son by name, they would be proclaiming this coming judgment. Imagine young Jezreel growing up, learning what his name meant. Imagine him in the marketplace, at festivals, in the fields. Every introduction became a prophecy. Every time his mother called him for dinner, she was announcing Israel's doom. Every time his father spoke his name with affection, he was simultaneously declaring divine judgment. The child couldn't escape the message he embodied simply by being alive. Then came a daughter, and God's command grew even more terrible. "Call her Lo Ruhamah, for I will no longer show love to Israel that I should at all forgive them." Lo Ruhamah. The name meant not loved or not pitied or no mercy. It was the negation of one of God's most fundamental attributes. Yahweh had always been described as compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. But now God was declaring that compassion had reached its limit. Mercy had been exhausted. Love had been rejected so many times that it would be withdrawn. For a father to name his daughter unloved violated every natural instinct. Parents throughout history have given children names that speak blessing, that express hope, that declare the child's worth and the parent's joy. Even in difficult circumstances, even among poor families, children received names that affirmed their humanity and dignity. But Hosea had to stand before witnesses and officially register his daughter's name as not loved, branding her from birth with rejection. What did this do to the girl as she grew? Did she understand that the name wasn't about her personally, but about Israel's spiritual condition? Or did she internalize the message, wondering why her father had marked her with such a painful designation? Did other children taunt her, using her name as a weapon? Did she resent her role as a living prophecy, wishing she could just be a normal girl with a normal name? The community must have reacted with increasing discomfort. Jezreel's name had been disturbing enough, but at least it was a real place name that could be rationalized. Lo Ruhamah crossed a line. This was a child deliberately named to proclaim divine rejection. The prophet's household had become increasingly strange, a family where children bore names of judgment instead of blessing, where nothing was normal and everything carried prophetic weight. Then came the third child, another son. and the name God commanded was the most devastating yet. Call him Lo-Ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Lo-Ami, not my people. This was covenant language turned inside out. At Mount Sinai, God had declared Israel to be his treasured possession, a people holy to the Lord. You will be my people, and I will be your God, the covenant promised. That relationship formed the foundation of Israel's identity. They weren't just another nation. They were God's chosen ones, set apart for divine purposes. Now that relationship was being formally dissolved. The covenant was being declared null and void. Israel was being divorced, cast off, no longer recognized as belonging to Yahweh. And the announcement came through the name of a child born in a prophet's household, a boy who would grow up bearing the weight of ultimate rejection, the negation of everything Israel believed about their special status. 3 children, 3 devastating names. Jezreel, Lo-Ruhamah, Lo-Ami, God scatters, not loved, not my people. Walking together through Samaria's streets, they were a living indictment, a family shaped entirely by prophetic message, children whose very existence proclaimed Israel's doom. But whose children were they? Here the text introduces an uncomfortable ambiguity that has troubled readers for millennia. The first child is clearly identified as Gomer's son born to Hosea. But the second and third children are described simply as children Gomer bore, with no mention of Hosea as their father. The shift in language is subtle but significant, and it has sparked endless debate. Some interpreters insist all 3 children were Hosea's biological offspring. The change in description simply reflects Hebrew narrative style, they argue, with no implications about paternity. The prophetic message was carried through the names, not through questions about biological fatherhood. Hosea may have had doubts or suspicions, but the text neither confirms nor denies them. Others see the language shift as deliberate and meaningful. Perhaps Gomer had already returned to prostitution by the time the second and third children were conceived. Perhaps Hosea couldn't be certain he was their father. Perhaps the uncertainty itself was part of the prophetic point. Israel claimed to be God's children while acting like offspring of other gods. Hosea raised children who might not be his own, just as God had raised Israel despite their spiritual adultery making their relationship questionable. The ambiguity may be the point. Did the children's paternity matter? Whether they were biologically Hosea's or not, he claimed them as his own, named them as God commanded, raised them in his household. His willingness to be father to children who might have been conceived through his wife's adultery mirrored God's continued care for Israel despite their spiritual adultery. The uncertainty didn't diminish the prophetic message. If anything, it intensified it. For Hosea, the question of paternity must have been agonizing. Looking at his second and third children, wondering if they carried his blood or the blood of men who had used his wife for a fee or as part of fertility cult rituals. Loving them because they were children in his care, yet feeling the knife twist of doubt every time he questioned their origins. The prophet's pain had multiple layers, each one teaching something about divine experience with an unfaithful people. For Gomer, raising these children with their terrible names must have been its own form of suffering. Every time she called them, she proclaimed judgment. Every time she introduced her daughter to someone new, she had to say, "This is Lo-Ruhamah," and watch reactions range from pity to contempt. Every time her youngest son asked about his name's meaning, she had to explain covenant rejection. The children were constant reminders of Israel's unfaithfulness and perhaps of her own. The children themselves were innocent victims of a prophetic drama they never chose. They hadn't selected their names, they hadn't volunteered to be living sermons, they were simply born into a household where normal family life was impossible because everything served divine message. They ate meals under the weight of judgment. They played games while bearing names of rejection. They grew up knowing that their very existence made people uncomfortable, that they represented something larger and more terrible than themselves. Imagine them at festivals where other children ran freely while they carried the burden of their names. Imagine them in the marketplace where transactions paused and whispers followed them. Imagine them at night lying on their mats, perhaps asking their father why God had chosen them for this peculiar suffering. Imagine Hosea's answers, trying to help them understand that they were part of something important, that their pain served divine purposes, that their names spoke truth Israel needed to hear, even if it made their own lives harder. Walking through Israel's streets, these three children proclaimed a message no one wanted to hear. The kingdom would be scattered, divine love would be withdrawn, the covenant relationship would end. People could cover their ears when Hosea preached, could turn away when he stood in the town square proclaiming judgment. But they couldn't avoid seeing his children, couldn't unhear their names being called out in ordinary life, couldn't escape the prophetic indictment that moved through their communities in the form of a prophet's troubled family. The children of judgment had been born. Now they would grow up in the shadow of their terrible names, living prophecies that spoke louder than words, human beings caught in a divine drama whose implications would only become clear when armies came from the north and everything their names had proclaimed came brutally true. The children of judgment walked Israel's streets bearing their terrible names. But an even darker chapter of Hosea's story was unfolding behind closed doors. The marriage that had shocked the nation was crumbling, and this time the scandal wasn't something God commanded, but something Gomer chose. She was leaving, returning to the life Hosea thought she had abandoned, going back to her lovers despite the covenant that bound her to the prophet. The text doesn't give us the precise moment when it happened. We don't know if Gomer left suddenly or if her departure was gradual, a slow drift back toward her former ways. Perhaps it started with lingering glances at men in the marketplace. Perhaps she began disappearing for hours without explanation. Perhaps Hosea came home one day to find her gone, the children asking where their mother had gone, and he had no answer that wouldn't break their hearts along with his own. What we do know is the devastating reality. Gomer, the woman Hosea had married in obedience to God's command, the woman he had made his wife despite her past, the woman who had borne his children and shared his home, was being unfaithful. She was pursuing other lovers, going after those who gave her bread and water, her wool and linen, her oil and drink. The very thing the marriage was meant to illustrate, Israel's spiritual adultery, was now playing out in literal, painful reality in the prophet's own household. Imagine Hosea's anguish. He had known from the beginning that Gomer was a woman of promiscuity. God had told him that much when commanding the marriage. But knowing someone has a past is different from watching them return to it. Marrying a prostitute in obedience to divine calling is different from coming home to an empty bed night after night, wondering where your wife is and whose arms she's in. Intellectual understanding is no shield against the gut-wrenching pain of personal betrayal. Every absence cut like a blade. Every rumor that reached his ears felt like a fresh wound. Did people tell him when they saw Gomer with other men? Did friends approach him with that terrible mixture of pity and gossip, wanting to inform him of what everyone else already knew? Or did he discover her infidelity through the knowing looks and whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room? The prophet who was supposed to stand with authority, speaking God's words to a wayward nation, now stood humiliated in his own community. His wife was making a fool of him. His household was in disarray. His children were growing up watching their mother come and go, learning lessons about faithfulness and love that contradicted everything covenant relationship was supposed to teach. Hosea's personal life had become a disaster, and everyone was watching. But this wasn't just personal tragedy. It was prophecy being lived out in real time. God had commanded the marriage precisely because it would mirror his relationship with Israel. Now that mirror was reflecting something so painful that perhaps even Hosea hadn't fully anticipated how much it would cost him. He was experiencing in his flesh what God experienced in spirit, the agony of loving someone who wouldn't stay, of offering covenant faithfulness to someone who preferred other lovers. The parallel to Israel's spiritual adultery couldn't have been more exact. Gomer was chasing after lovers who gave her material provision, bread and water, wool and linen, oil and drink. Israel was chasing after other gods and foreign alliances for the same reasons, seeking material security and prosperity from sources other than Yahweh. Both were committing the same fundamental error, attributing their provision to the wrong source, trusting in false lovers instead of their covenant partner. Israel looked at their agricultural abundance and credited Baal, the storm god who supposedly controlled rain and fertility. They saw their wool and linen, their oil and wine as gifts from Canaanite deities rather than blessings from Yahweh. They had forgotten or deliberately ignored that everything they possessed came from the God who had delivered them from Egypt, who had given them the land, who had established them as a nation. Like Gomer, they said of their false lovers, "I will go after them, for they give me good things." The political dimension of Israel's adultery was equally clear. The nation kept making alliances with foreign powers, trusting in Egyptian or Assyrian backing instead of trusting in God's protection. They paid tribute to pagan empires, sought treaties with idolatrous kings, and compromised their covenant identity in exchange for promises of security that never materialized. Each alliance was a form of spiritual prostitution, selling themselves to foreign gods and foreign powers for perceived safety and advantage. Hosea's prophecies during this period drip with the pain of personal experience. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. But the more I called them, the further they went from me. They sacrificed to the Baals and burned incense to images. These weren't abstract theological statements. They were words torn from a heart that knew exactly what it felt like to love someone who kept walking away, to call someone who refused to respond, to offer covenant loyalty to someone who preferred the arms of others. The prophet's message rang with authenticity because it wasn't theoretical. When Hosea spoke about God's pain at Israel's unfaithfulness, he wasn't guessing or imagining. He knew that pain intimately. He lived with it every day. His empty bed preached a sermon about divine heartbreak. His absent wife illustrated covenant betrayal. His personal humiliation gave him authority to speak about God's humiliation at Israel's hands. Gomer's betrayal revealed something profound about the nature of love and faithfulness. Hosea could have divorced her. Israelite law permitted divorce for adultery. He would have been justified, even expected, to send her away with a certificate of divorce and be done with the whole mess. The community would have understood. His reputation might even have been partially restored if he distanced himself from her unfaithfulness. But that wasn't the message God needed Hosea to embody. The point wasn't that betrayal deserves abandonment. The point was that covenant love persists even in the face of betrayal, that faithfulness doesn't depend on reciprocation, that commitment can outlast unfaithfulness. Hosea's pain was part of the prophecy. His choice to keep loving Gomer despite her adultery mirrored God's choice to keep loving Israel despite their spiritual prostitution. Every night Hosea spent alone wondering where Gomer was, he was living out God's experience with Israel. Every morning he woke up to an empty house, he was feeling what God felt watching Israel worship at high places and fertility shrines. Every time neighbors gave him pitying looks or made snide comments about his inability to control his wife, he was tasting the humiliation God experienced as the nations mocked Israel's God for not being able to keep his people faithful. The prophecy went beyond mere illustration into incarnation. Hosea wasn't just talking about divine pain, he was embodying it. His personal heartbreak had become sacramental, a visible sign of an invisible reality. The prophet's suffering was God's suffering made manifest in human form. The marriage that had shocked the nation was now breaking the prophet's heart in ways that preached more powerfully than any sermon could. Gomer's lovers, whoever they were, represented everything false that promised satisfaction but delivered only emptiness. Like Israel's false gods, they offered immediate gratification but no lasting security. Like Israel's political alliances, they provided temporary advantage but ultimate betrayal. Gomer was chasing illusions, trading the security of covenant marriage for the fleeting pleasures of adultery. Just as Israel was trading covenant relationship with Yahweh for the empty promises of Baal worship and foreign treaties. The tragedy was that Gomer was wrong about her lovers. They weren't really providing what she needed. She attributed her bread and water, her wool and linen to them, but the text makes clear that these things actually came from Hosea, from the covenant partner she was betraying. Similarly, Israel attributed their prosperity to Baal and to their political alliances, not recognizing that everything they had came from Yahweh, from the covenant God they were abandoning. Both Gomer and Israel were engaged in a form of willful blindness, choosing to credit false sources rather than acknowledge their true provider. Both were destroying the relationships that actually sustained them in favor of relationships that exploited them. Both were acting like the provision would continue regardless of their faithfulness, not understanding that their betrayal was severing the very source of what they valued. Hosea's personal heartbreak had become God's message to Israel, spoken not just in words, but in lived reality. The prophet's pain was the sermon. His humiliation was the illustration. His continuing love for an unfaithful wife was the revelation of divine character that Israel most needed to understand but least wanted to hear. Gomer's betrayal had turned Hosea's life into a walking prophecy more powerful than anything he could merely speak. And the worst part was that this was only the beginning. The story would get darker still before any light of redemption could break through. Gomer's betrayal had turned Hosea's life into a walking prophecy, but behind the prophetic symbolism lived a man in genuine anguish. The emotional weight of what Hosea experienced cannot be reduced to mere theological illustration. This was real pain, the kind that wakes you at night with your heart pounding, the kind that steals appetite and joy, the kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew about love and calling and obedience to God. Morning came with a particular cruelty. The moment between sleep and full waking when for just a second you forget the pain, and then memory crashes back with crushing force. She's gone. Again, or still. Hosea would open his eyes to an empty space beside him where a wife should be, and the wound would feel fresh every single time, as if betrayal was something that could be experienced anew each dawn rather than something you eventually grew numb to. The children needed breakfast. Jezreel, Lo Ruhama, Lo Ami. 3 young lives depending on him to provide stability in a household that had none. They asked questions he couldn't answer honestly without destroying whatever innocence they had left. Where's Mother? When is she coming back? Why does she leave? Hosea had to choose between lies that protected them and truths that wounded them, knowing that either choice would scar them in different ways. He was a prophet, called to speak truth, yet he lived surrounded by necessary deceptions. He told the children their mother would return, not knowing if it was true. He told himself he was strong enough to endure this, not believing it. He told the community that God's purposes were being fulfilled, while privately wondering if he had misheard the original command, if there had been some way to obey that wouldn't have cost him everything. The humiliation cut deeper than the heartbreak. Hosea wasn't just a husband with an unfaithful wife, he was a prophet of Yahweh, someone who stood before the people claiming to speak divine truth. His moral authority depended on people taking him seriously. How could anyone take seriously a man who couldn't even keep his own wife faithful? How could he call Israel to covenant loyalty when his own household embodied covenant violation? Every public appearance became an exercise in enduring shame. Walking through the marketplace meant passing men who might have been with Gomer. Standing in the town gate to deliver prophecy meant seeing knowing looks exchanged among listeners who dismissed his message because of his personal circumstances. Leading worship meant feeling the weight of silent judgment from people who thought a man with his domestic situation had no business speaking about holiness. The religious establishment used his marriage as a weapon against him. Priests who were themselves corrupt, who tolerated or participated in the very syncretism Hosea condemned, suddenly became paragons of family values when criticizing the prophet. They pointed to his unfaithful wife as proof that God wasn't really with him, that his prophecies couldn't be trusted, that his call to return to covenant faithfulness was hypocrisy from a man who couldn't maintain faithfulness in his own home. Some of the criticism came wrapped in false sympathy. People approached Hosea with concerned faces, telling him they were praying for his situation, suggesting that perhaps if he were a better husband, Gomer wouldn't stray, wondering aloud whether his devotion to prophetic ministry had caused him to neglect his marriage. The implied blame stung worse than open mockery because it exploited his own doubts and guilt. Had he failed Gomer somehow? Was there something he could have done differently that would have made her stay? Should he have been less consumed with prophetic calling and more attentive to his wife's needs? The questions gnawed at him in quiet moments, accusations whispered by a voice that sounded like his own but carried the poison of the enemy who loves to turn victims into their own prosecutors. Yet through all this pain, something remarkable was happening. Hosea was discovering God's heart in a way that comfortable prophets never could. The suffering wasn't arbitrary or meaningless. It was initiation into divine experience, a brutal but authentic education in what it means to love someone who won't love you back, to remain faithful to someone who has abandoned faithfulness, to keep covenant with someone who has broken every covenant promise. Every emotion Hosea felt, God felt about Israel. The shock of betrayal, God knew it intimately, had experienced it repeatedly as Israel turned to other gods. The humiliation of having an unfaithful partner, God felt it as the nations mocked Israel's inability to remain loyal to their own deity. The exhausting cycle of hope and disappointment, thinking she had changed only to discover her back in her old ways. God lived that cycle with Israel generation after generation. Hosea's pain gave him authority that no amount of theological study could have provided. He wasn't speculating about divine emotions. He was experiencing them. When he spoke about God's grief over Israel's unfaithfulness, tears on his own cheeks proved he understood grief. When he proclaimed God's anger at covenant violation, his own righteous fury at being betrayed validated the message. When he whispered about divine love that persisted despite rejection, his continuing commitment to Gomer demonstrated that such love was possible even if it seemed foolish. The personal tragedy was shaping his prophetic message in profound ways. Hosea's oracles during this period have a quality unlike other prophets. They oscillate between judgment and mercy, between anger and tenderness, between threats of destruction and promises of restoration. These weren't theological contradictions but emotional authenticity, the complex feelings of someone whose love has been deeply wounded but not destroyed. How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? These words came from a heart that knew exactly what it meant to struggle with letting go of someone who deserved to be released. My heart is changed within me. All my compassion is aroused. This wasn't abstract theology, but lived experience translated into divine voice. Hosea knew that feeling, the internal war between what someone deserves and what love compels you to offer anyway. The community watched this drama unfold with mixed reactions. Some genuinely pitied Hosea, seeing his suffering and aching for him. They brought food when he was too devastated to cook. They included his children in their own family activities when Hosea was too overwhelmed to provide normal childhood experiences. They sat with him in silence when words were inadequate, offering presents rather than platitudes. Others treated him with contempt disguised as concern. They whispered that this was what happened when you married a prostitute, that he had brought this suffering on himself through his foolish choice, that God couldn't possibly have commanded something that resulted in such disaster. They used his pain as entertainment, the prophet's tragic marriage providing gossip that made their own dysfunctional relationships seem normal by comparison. Still others saw Hosea's suffering and began to understand the message. The prophet's pain was too authentic to dismiss, too raw to be merely theatrical. Watching him continue to love Gomer despite her betrayals, continuing to provide for children who might not be his, continuing to speak God's word while his own life fell apart, some began to grasp what God was trying to communicate. If Hosea could love like this, how much more could God? If a human prophet could maintain faithfulness in the face of such unfaithfulness, how much more faithful was the divine covenant partner? The scandal that had begun with the wedding had deepened into something more profound. Now it wasn't just that a prophet had married a prostitute. It was that a prophet was loving a prostitute who had returned to prostitution, was remaining faithful to someone who had abandoned faithfulness, was keeping covenant with someone who broke covenant repeatedly. The scandal had become a revelation of character, both human and divine. Hosea's internal struggle was teaching him things about God that comfortable prosperity could never reveal. He was learning that covenant love isn't a feeling that depends on reciprocation, but a commitment that persists regardless of response. He was discovering that faithfulness isn't conditional on being treated fairly, but a choice to keep promises even when the other party has broken theirs. He was understanding that divine patience isn't weakness but strength, that mercy isn't the absence of justice but something that operates on a different plane entirely. Late at night, when the children were finally asleep and the house was quiet except for the absence of the one person who should be there, Hosea would pray. Not eloquent prophetic prayers, but raw, honest cries of a man at the end of his strength. Why did you call me to this? How long can I endure? What purpose is served by this suffering? And in those moments of deepest pain, when he felt most alone and most tempted to give up, he found himself closest to the heart of God. Because God knew exactly what he was feeling. Every moment of Hosea's anguish God had experienced with Israel. Every betrayal the prophet endured, God had endured from his chosen people. Every time Hosea wanted to walk away but chose to stay, he was acting out divine character. The prophet's pain had become a doorway into divine experience, and through that doorway flowed the most powerful prophetic message Hosea would ever deliver. Not spoken with words alone, but incarnated in his suffering, his persistence, and his refusal to stop loving someone who had given him every reason to quit. The prophet's pain had become a doorway into divine experience, and through that doorway Hosea could now see with terrible clarity the full extent of Israel's betrayal. His personal anguish over Gomer's adultery had given him eyes to recognize the nation's spiritual prostitution for what it truly was. This wasn't merely religious pluralism or cultural accommodation. This was covenant violation of the deepest kind, a wholesale abandonment of the exclusive relationship that defined Israel's very identity. Everywhere Hosea looked, he saw the evidence. High places dotted the landscape like a rash across the nation's skin. These weren't the discreet shrines of private devotion, but public centers of worship that operated openly, boldly, without shame. On hilltops and under spreading trees, altars smoked with sacrifices offered to gods whose names should never have been spoken by Israelite lips. Baal dominated the religious landscape of northern Israel. The Canaanite storm god had been worshipped in these lands long before Israelite ancestors arrived, and his cult had proven remarkably persistent despite generations of prophetic opposition. To agricultural communities dependent on rain for survival, Baal's appeal was visceral and immediate. He was the lord of storms, the rider of clouds, the one who supposedly controlled whether crops flourished or failed. The logic seemed sound to minds shaped by desperation and pragmatism. Yahweh might be the God of the covenant, the deliverer from Egypt, the giver of law. But Baal appeared more directly relevant to daily survival. When dark clouds gathered on the horizon, when the first rains of autumn needed to come at the right time, when fields required moisture to produce grain, why not seek favor from the deity specifically associated with weather? Why not cover all bases honoring Yahweh for national identity while appealing to Baal for agricultural prosperity? This reasoning revealed how thoroughly Israel had misunderstood their covenant relationship. Yahweh wasn't one God among many, each with their own portfolio of responsibilities. He was the God who created heaven and earth, who controlled all natural forces, who gave or withheld rain according to his purposes. The division of labor that Israelites imagined, where Yahweh handled spiritual matters while Baal managed agriculture, was a fiction that betrayed fundamental ignorance of who Yahweh actually was. But the worship of Baal carried implications far beyond theological confusion. The fertility cult practices associated with his worship involved ritual acts that struck at the heart of covenant morality. Temple prostitutes, both male and female, served at shrines throughout Israel. Their services were understood as sacred acts, ways of participating in divine fertility that would translate into abundant crops and livestock. Israelite men visited these prostitutes as part of religious observance. They saw no contradiction between their covenant identity and these sexual rituals. In their minds, they were honoring the forces that controlled nature's productivity. They were ensuring good harvests through sympathetic magic, aligning earthly sexual activity with divine creative power. The fact that such practices were explicitly forbidden in covenant law seemed irrelevant to people who had convinced themselves that religious obligation required what God had prohibited. Women brought offerings to Asherah, Baal's consort, and the Canaanite mother goddess. They sought her blessing for conception and childbirth, for the fertility of their own bodies as farmers sought fertility for their fields. Wooden poles representing Asherah stood beside altars, sacred trees marked her presence, and worship included acts that would have been recognized as witchcraft and idolatry by earlier generations but had become normalized through gradual accommodation. The prophet saw through these rationalizations to the ugly reality beneath. What Israel called worship was spiritual prostitution. What they defended as practical religion was covenant betrayal. Every visit to a shrine prostitute was adultery against Yahweh. Every offering to Baal was a declaration that they trusted false gods more than their covenant partner. Every Asherah pole represented a rival lover stealing affection that belonged exclusively to the God who had chosen Israel as his bride. Hosea's oracles during this period burn with the pain of personal experience translated into divine indictment. She decked herself with rings and jewelry and went after her lovers, but me she forgot, declares the Lord. These weren't abstract accusations, but descriptions of Gomer's actual behavior and of Israel's spiritual equivalent. Both had adorned themselves for other lovers. Both had pursued relationships that violated their primary covenant. Both had forgotten the one who actually provided for them. The nation's political alliances carried the same character of spiritual adultery. Israel's kings constantly maneuvered between the great powers, seeking security through treaties with Egypt or Assyria, rather than trusting in Yahweh's protection. They paid tribute to foreign emperors, sought military backing from pagan armies, and compromised their independence in exchange for promises that never delivered lasting security. Each political alliance involved religious dimensions that Israel's leaders seemed willing to overlook. Treaties with foreign powers typically included recognition of those nations' gods, participation in their religious ceremonies, and accommodation of their worship practices. When Israel sought Egyptian help, they implicitly acknowledged Egyptian deities. When they submitted to Assyrian dominance, they accepted Assyrian religious claims. Political pragmatism became the excuse for theological compromise. From heaven's perspective, these alliances were no different than Gomer going after lovers who promised to provide bread and water, wool and linen. Israel was seeking from foreign powers what they should have sought from Yahweh. They were trusting in human armies rather than divine protection, in political maneuvering rather than covenant faithfulness, in their own diplomatic cleverness rather than in God's power to save. The tragedy was that Israel's alliances consistently failed to deliver what they promised. Egypt proved unreliable, making grand promises but providing little actual help when Assyria came knocking. Assyria demanded crippling tribute that drained the nation's wealth and sovereignty. Each alliance left Israel weaker, more dependent, less able to maintain independence. Yet the cycle continued, with each generation thinking they could somehow manage what their predecessors could not, finding security through their own efforts rather than through trust in divine covenant. Underlying all of this, both religious and political, was Israel's fundamental refusal to acknowledge Yahweh as their provider. This was the core betrayal that made everything else possible. The nation looked at their prosperity, their abundant harvests, their successful trade, and attributed these blessings to the wrong sources. They credited Baal for rain. They thanked Asherah for children. They saw their wealth as the fruit of smart political alliances and savvy international relations. Hosea's prophecies repeatedly confronted this willful blindness. She said, "I will go after my lovers who give me my food and my water, my wool and my linen, my oil and my drink." But she does not acknowledge that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine and oil, who lavished on her the silver and gold which they used for Baal. The parallel to Gomer was exact. Both wife and nation attributed provision to false sources, failing to recognize that everything they valued came from the covenant partner they were betraying. This refusal to acknowledge Yahweh's provision wasn't innocent ignorance but deliberate choice. The prophets had been warning for generations. The covenant itself spelled out clearly that blessings came from Yahweh's hand, that rain fell or drought came according to covenant faithfulness, that prosperity or disaster followed obedience or rebellion. Israel knew the truth. They simply chose to believe a more convenient fiction. The depth of Israel's unfaithfulness was measured not just by individual acts of idolatry, but by how thoroughly syncretism had penetrated every level of society. This wasn't a fringe movement or minority practice. Kings authorized it. Priests facilitated it. The wealthy benefited from it. The poor participated in it. Entire communities organized their religious calendar around festivals that mixed Yahweh worship with Canaanite practices until the distinction between them disappeared. Children grew up never knowing pure covenant worship. They learned from birth that religion meant honoring multiple deities, that spiritual wisdom meant hedging your bets, that faithfulness was flexible enough to accommodate whatever practices seemed most advantageous at the moment. The corruption had become normalized, passed down through generations until what earlier prophets would have recognized immediately as apostasy simply looked like normal religious life to 8th century Israelites. The religious establishment had failed its fundamental responsibility to maintain covenant faithfulness. Instead of teaching the people to trust Yahweh alone, priests led them into syncretism. Instead of calling out idolatry, they accommodated it. Instead of maintaining the boundaries that kept Israel distinct from surrounding nations, they allowed and even encouraged the blurring of those boundaries until Israel's religion looked barely distinguishable from Canaanite paganism. Hosea saw all of this with eyes opened by personal pain. His wife's adultery had taught him to recognize Israel's spiritual prostitution. His experience of loving someone who credited others for what he provided had shown him the heartbreak of watching Israel thank Baal for blessings that came from Yahweh. His struggle with a covenant partner who wouldn't honor their covenant had given him insight into God's experience with a nation that wore covenant identity like a costume while acting like pagans. The indictment was complete. Israel stood guilty of spiritual adultery at every level, from the throne to the shrine, from the marketplace to the bedroom, from public worship to private practice. They had prostituted themselves to other gods and foreign powers, had attributed Yahweh's provision to false sources, and had violated every aspect of their covenant relationship. The question now was whether judgment could be avoided, or whether the betrayal had gone too far for mercy to bridge the gap. The indictment was complete, but to understand why Israel's spiritual prostitution carried such devastating consequences, we must grasp what they had actually broken. The covenant between Yahweh and Israel wasn't a casual agreement or a religious preference that could be modified at will. It was the foundation of everything, the defining relationship that made Israel who they were, the sacred bond that separated them from all other nations on earth. The covenant story began not with Israel but with one man, Abraham, called out of Ur of the Chaldeans to journey to a land he had never seen. God made promises to this wandering nomad that seemed impossible. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. Through you all nations will be blessed. I will give your offspring this land. These weren't negotiated terms but divine declarations, a one-sided commitment that God initiated and pledged to fulfill. Generations passed. Abraham's grandson Jacob wrestled with God and received a new name, Israel. His 12 sons became 12 tribes. Famine drove them to Egypt, where they multiplied into a great people, then fell into slavery under pharaohs who forgot Joseph's service. For 400 years they groaned under oppression, crying out to a God who seemed to have forgotten his promises. But God had not forgotten. He raised up Moses, confronted Pharaoh with plagues that demonstrated divine supremacy over Egyptian gods, and delivered Israel through the Red Sea in an act of salvation that would define their identity forever. You saw what I did to Egypt, God reminded them, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. The Exodus wasn't just political liberation but divine claim. God had rescued them not merely to free them, but to make them his own possession. At Mount Sinai, the covenant reached its formal expression. Thunder rolled, lightning flashed, the mountain trembled with divine presence. Moses ascended into the cloud and received law, not as arbitrary rules but as the terms of relationship, the shape that life must take for a people in covenant with this holy God. The 10 Commandments began not with prohibition but with identity. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Everything that followed flowed from that relationship. The covenant was explicitly described in marital terms from the beginning. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God, Yahweh declared. The language was intimate, exclusive, permanent. This wasn't a business contract or a political alliance. It was marriage, a total commitment of one party to another with expectations of faithfulness that went far deeper than mere external compliance. The marriage metaphor wasn't arbitrary but carefully chosen to communicate the depth of relationship God intended. Marriage in ancient Israel was the most binding covenant two parties could make, creating kinship where none existed before, joining two people into one flesh with obligations that superseded all other loyalties. When a man married a woman, he pledged exclusive sexual faithfulness, permanent commitment, and provision for all her needs. When a woman married a man, she pledged exclusive loyalty, faithful partnership, and devotion that placed him above all other relationships, including her birth family. This was the framework God used to describe his relationship with Israel. He was the husband who had chosen them, rescued them, provided for them, and pledged himself to them in permanent covenant. They were the wife who pledged exclusive worship, faithful obedience, and trust in his provision. The covenant wasn't one-sided obligation, but mutual relationship, with each party having both privileges and responsibilities that flowed from their bond. But Israel's history from Sinai forward was a repeating cycle of faithlessness. While Moses was still on the mountain receiving law, the people below were already building a golden calf, declaring it to be the God who brought them from Egypt. The pattern established in that first betrayal would repeat across centuries. Israel would pledge faithfulness, then turn to other gods. They would experience the consequences of covenant violation, cry out for deliverance, receive mercy, and then repeat the cycle again. The book of Judges recorded this pattern with monotonous regularity. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders. Then they cried out to the Lord, who raised up judges who saved them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors. The covenant pattern included both blessing and curse, clearly spelled out from the beginning. Faithfulness would bring prosperity, peace, abundant harvests, military victory, and divine presence. Unfaithfulness would bring drought, military defeat, foreign oppression, and ultimately exile from the land. These weren't arbitrary punishments, but natural consequences of covenant relationship. Breaking covenant with the source of all blessing meant losing access to those blessings. What makes Israel's unfaithfulness so striking is how patient God proved to be. The covenant terms gave him every right to destroy them after the golden calf incident. Every subsequent betrayal justified abandonment. Yet generation after generation, God continued to pursue this faithless bride, sending prophets to call her back, providing new opportunities for repentance, offering mercy when justice would have been completely appropriate. God's repeated attempts to win back his bride revealed something profound about divine character. This wasn't a deity who gave up easily or who maintained relationships only when convenient. This was a God whose covenant commitment ran deeper than human faithfulness or unfaithfulness, whose love persisted despite rejection, whose mercy operated on a timeline that human logic couldn't comprehend. The prophets before Hosea had all delivered similar messages, calling Israel back to covenant faithfulness. Samuel had warned against demanding a king like other nations. Nathan had confronted David's adultery, showing that even the greatest king wasn't above covenant law. Elijah had challenged Baal worship dramatically on Mount Carmel. Amos, Hosea's contemporary, thundered against the social injustice that always accompanied spiritual corruption. Each prophet was an attempted intervention, God refusing to give up on the relationship despite every reason to walk away. But Hosea's message carried unique power because it emerged from lived experience. Other prophets spoke about covenant violation theoretically. Hosea embodied it practically. His pain made God's pain visible. His ongoing commitment to Gomer despite her adultery made God's ongoing commitment to Israel comprehensible in human terms. The marriage metaphor that had always been part of covenant language suddenly had flesh and blood reality in the prophet's household. The justice of divine judgment, when it finally came, couldn't be questioned by anyone who understood covenant terms. Israel had broken every commitment, violated every boundary, ignored every warning. They had pursued other gods while claiming Yahweh's protection. They had practiced the very things covenant explicitly prohibited while expecting covenant blessings to continue. They had turned marriage to Yahweh into prostitution with anyone who offered perceived advantage. Judgment wasn't divine rage or vindictiveness, but covenant enforcement. The curses promised for unfaithfulness were being activated because unfaithfulness had reached levels that made them unavoidable. Assyria gathering on the horizon wasn't random geopolitical misfortune, but divine instrument of covenant discipline. The coming exile wasn't tragedy without meaning, but consequence clearly outlined in covenant terms from the beginning. Yet even in pronouncing judgment, God's words through Hosea revealed conflicted divine emotions that spoke to the depth of covenant relationship. How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? My heart is changed within me. All my compassion is aroused. These weren't the words of a judge dispassionately applying law, but of a betrayed spouse struggling with the pain of necessary separation. The covenant framework helped make sense of why Israel's spiritual adultery mattered so much. This wasn't about God being petty or jealous in some small-minded human sense. This was about relationship that gave Israel their identity, their purpose, their very existence as a people. Breaking covenant with Yahweh wasn't adding other religious practices to their spiritual portfolio. It was denying the relationship that defined who they were. Marriage makes demands precisely because it creates union. A married person cannot act as though they're single without destroying the marriage. Covenant with Yahweh made similar demands. Israel couldn't worship other gods while claiming covenant relationship with Yahweh any more than Gomer could take other lovers while claiming marriage to Hosea. The exclusivity wasn't arbitrary restriction but inherent requirement of the relationship itself. The tragedy was that Israel never grasped this. They thought they could have it both ways, maintain covenant identity while pursuing other gods, claim Yahweh's blessings while giving credit to Baal, expect divine protection while seeking security through foreign alliances. They treated covenant like a religious preference that could be supplemented rather than like a marriage that demanded exclusive faithfulness. The theological center of Hosea's message was this: covenant creates relationship that cannot be violated without destroying what the covenant established. Israel's unfaithfulness wasn't policy disagreement with God, but betrayal of the spouse who had rescued them, married them, and pledged everything to them. The coming judgment was heartbreaking but just, painful but necessary, the consequence of breaking what should never have been broken. And yet, as the next chapters would reveal, even this wasn't the end of the story. Because covenant love, once pledged, proved harder to kill than anyone imagined. Covenant love, once pledged, proved harder to kill than anyone imagined. And now God was about to demonstrate exactly how far that love would go. Just when it seemed the story of Hosea and Gomer had reached its tragic conclusion, just when separation appeared final and judgment inevitable, God spoke again with a command even more shocking than the first. Go, show your love to your wife again, though she is loved by another man and is an adulteress. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods. The divine command arrived with devastating clarity. Hosea was to go after Gomer again, not to confront her, not to divorce her formally, not to bring her to justice for covenant violation. He was to love her, to pursue her, to bring her back. The Hebrew word used here is particularly striking, emphasizing active, ongoing love rather than mere emotion. This wasn't about feeling affection for someone who had destroyed his life. This was about choosing love as action, as commitment, as costly pursuit of someone who didn't deserve it and hadn't asked for it. But there was a complication. Gomer wasn't free. The woman who had left Hosea's house to pursue other lovers had ended up in circumstances far worse than the marriage she abandoned. The text doesn't give us all the details, but what it does reveal is sobering. Hosea would have to buy her back. The freely given bride of his youth, the woman he had married in obedience to God's first command, now belonged to someone else. She had become property to be purchased. 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and a lethek of barley. The price is recorded with precision that speaks volumes. 15 shekels was half the standard price of a slave according to Exodus law. Either Gomer was being sold at reduced rate because of age or condition, or Hosea was paying what he could afford, making up the difference with grain. The barley, a cheaper grain than wheat, suggests he was scraping together whatever resources he possessed to meet the redemption price. This wasn't the triumphant rescue of romantic fiction. This was a prophet emptying his pockets and his granary to purchase what should never have been for sale. The woman who had shared his bed, borne his children, and carried his name was now being sold in a marketplace, and he was forced to compete with other potential buyers to reclaim her. Where did Hosea find her? The text preserves respectful silence about the specific circumstances, but ancient readers would have understood the implications. Women ended up as slaves through several paths. Perhaps Gomer had sold herself to pay debts accumulated through her lifestyle. Perhaps she had been sold by a lover who tired of her. Perhaps she had been caught in some legal violation that resulted in enslavement. Whatever the path, the destination was the same. She had fallen from being a prophet's wife to being someone's property. Imagine the scene. Hosea arriving at a slave market or at the house of whoever owned Gomer. The recognition in her eyes when she saw him. Was it shame, relief, fear, resentment? The text doesn't tell us what she felt, preserving the focus on Hosea's action rather than her response. He came with his silver and his barley, counted it out, and purchased the woman who was already legally his wife. The humiliation must have been crushing. Everyone in the community would know what had happened. The prophet whose wife had left him was now buying her back like livestock. The man called to speak God's word was reduced to negotiating prices and counting out grain. The scandal of the original marriage paled compared to the scandal of the redemption. At least the first time Hosea had married with some dignity. Now he was buying damaged goods, reclaiming a wife who had proven spectacularly unfaithful. Yet this was precisely the point of the prophetic sign. God was going to redeem Israel, and redemption always comes at a cost. The freely given relationship of Sinai had been violated beyond repair. If there was to be a future, it would require purchase, payment, the bearing of cost by the innocent party to reclaim the guilty one. Hosea counting out his silver became a picture of divine love willing to pay whatever price necessary to bring back a faithless bride. The price itself carried symbolic weight. 15 shekels of silver was the price of a slave, but it was also approximately the bride price that would have been paid for a virgin bride in normal circumstances. Hosea was essentially remarrying Gomer, paying for her a second time, bearing the cost of bringing back someone who should never have left. The barley added to the price suggested he was giving everything he had, holding nothing back, emptying himself to accomplish the redemption. This mirrored God's redemption of Israel in profound ways. The exodus from Egypt had been a kind of purchase, a redemption from slavery, though the price was paid not in silver but in plagues and judgment on Egypt. God had bought Israel out of bondage and made them his own. But Israel's subsequent unfaithfulness had violated that relationship. Now, if there was to be restoration, it would require a new redemption, a new price paid, a new commitment that took into account all that had been broken. The scene of Hosea purchasing Gomer would have evoked memories of another redemption story in Israel's history. The book of Ruth told how Boaz acted as kinsman redeemer, purchasing both land and woman to preserve family line. But Boaz had redeemed a virtuous widow whose only crime was poverty and foreign birth. Hosea was redeeming an adulteress whose crimes were numerous and whose value in the marketplace had plummeted. His act of redemption spoke of love that redeemed, not the deserving but the undeserving, not the worthy but the worthless by market standards. The cost of reclaiming what was once freely given revealed something about the nature of love and covenant. Relationships that begin well can deteriorate to the point where restoration requires new investment, new commitment, new payment of price. The original gift, once spurned, cannot be simply picked up again as though nothing happened. There must be acknowledgement of what was broken, bearing of cost to make things right again, willingness to pay dearly for what should never have been lost. Hosea's willingness to pay the redemption price demonstrated love that went beyond rational calculation. No financial advisor would have recommended this purchase. No friend would have encouraged him to throw good money after bad. Every practical consideration argued for cutting losses and moving on. But love doesn't operate by cost-benefit analysis. Covenant commitment doesn't check market value before deciding whether to pursue. Hosea paid the price because God commanded it, and because somewhere beneath all the pain and betrayal, he still loved this woman who had destroyed his life. The moment of purchase must have been laden with complex emotions. Relief that she could be brought home. Anger at the circumstances that made purchase necessary. Grief over how far she had fallen. Determination to see the redemptive act through regardless of cost. Hosea handed over his silver and his barley, and in exchange received title to Gomer. The transaction was legal, binding, complete. She belonged to him again, though under very different circumstances than their original wedding. What did Gomer feel as this transpired? Did she want to be redeemed, or would she have preferred to remain where she was? Did Hosea's pursuit touch something in her heart, or did she feel only resentment at being purchased like cattle? The text's silence on her emotions is perhaps intentional, keeping focus on the redemptive action rather than the beloved's response. Redemption happens first as the Redeemer's choice, regardless of whether the redeemed recognizes the gift being given. The parallel to God's redemption of Israel couldn't be clearer. Israel had broken covenant, had pursued other lovers, had ended up enslaved to foreign powers and false gods. They deserved abandonment. Justice required judgment. Yet God was declaring through Hosea's redemptive act that he would pursue them anyway, would pay the price to bring them back, would redeem what had been freely given and foolishly squandered. The 15 shekels of silver and the barley weren't just payment for Gomer. They were a down payment on a truth that would echo through redemptive history. Love bears the cost of restoration. The innocent pays for the guilty. The faithful redeems the faithless. The one who was wronged absorbs the price of making things right. This was prophetic theater at its most powerful, a visual sermon about grace that goes beyond what anyone deserves or could earn. As Hosea led Gomer away from the marketplace back toward the home she had abandoned, both of them must have wondered what came next. The purchase was complete, but the restoration was just beginning. She was legally his again, but could she truly come home? He had paid the price, but could he genuinely welcome back someone who had wounded him so deeply? The redemption had been accomplished, but the real test of covenant love lay ahead in the daily reality of living together after such profound betrayal. The buyback was complete. Now came the harder part, learning to be married again. The buyback was complete, but Hosea didn't immediately restore Gomer to her former position as his wife. The redemption had been accomplished, the price paid, but restoration required a process that couldn't be rushed. Love that redeems must also discipline, and true reconciliation demands more than simply returning to how things were before betrayal shattered trust. What followed the purchase was a period of waiting, of purification, of painful but necessary transformation. Hosea's words to Gomer after buying her back carried both tenderness and firmness. "You are to live with me many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will behave the same way toward you." This wasn't rejection but recalibration. She would remain in his household under his protection and provision, but not yet restored to full marital intimacy. She would have no husband and no lovers, suspended between her past and her future. Given time to discover whether she truly wanted the covenant relationship being offered to her. The period of waiting wasn't punishment in the vindictive sense, but purification in the restorative sense. Gomer needed time away from the lovers she had pursued, space to break the patterns that had led her into slavery, opportunity to learn whether her desires had changed or whether she still longed for what had destroyed her. Hosea was offering her security, provision, and the possibility of restored marriage. But he was also requiring a demonstration that this time would be different. This wasn't easy for either of them. For Gomer, living in Hosea's house without the intimacy of marriage must have been strange and difficult. She was neither wife nor slave, neither fully accepted nor cast out. The children she had borne were there, constant reminders of happier times and painful questions about paternity. The community watched, wondering whether the prophet's purchased wife would prove faithful this time, or whether she would eventually return to her old ways. For Hosea, the waiting period required restraint that went against natural desire. He had paid dearly to bring her back, had committed himself to her restoration, yet he couldn't simply resume marital relations as though nothing had happened. Trust needed to be rebuilt. Character needed to be reformed. The relationship had to be reconstructed on a foundation stronger than their first attempt, which had ended in such catastrophic failure. The discipline of this waiting period reflected love that refused to settle for superficial reconciliation. Hosea could have bought Gomer back and immediately taken her to his bed, asserting his rights as husband and declaring the matter settled. But that would have changed nothing fundamental. She would still be the same person with the same weaknesses, still vulnerable to the same temptations that had led her astray before. The waiting created space for transformation that immediate restoration would have prevented. This period of isolation and purification mirrored exactly what God was declaring about Israel's future. The nation that had pursued other lovers would soon find herself with no husband and no lovers, suspended between judgment and restoration. Given time to discover whether her desires had genuinely changed, or whether she would simply repeat the same patterns when given opportunity. The coming exile to Assyria would strip away everything Israel had depended on. The political alliances they had pursued would prove worthless. The foreign gods they had worshipped would be unable to save them. The prosperity they had attributed to Baal would vanish. The land that symbolized covenant blessing would be lost. They would find themselves in a foreign territory, among pagans who served strange gods, cut off from temple and sacrifice, unable to practice the religious rituals that had defined their identity. But this exile wasn't merely punishment. It was discipline designed for restoration. Like Gomer living in Hosea's house without being fully restored as wife, Israel would live among the nations without being fully destroyed as a people. They would be preserved but transformed, disciplined but not abandoned, judged but not annihilated. The exile would create space for them to recognize the emptiness of what they had pursued and to long for the covenant relationship they had despised. The purpose of judgment throughout Hosea's prophecy was never destruction for its own sake, but restoration through discipline. God wasn't lashing out in wounded pride or vindictive anger. He was doing what had to be done to break patterns that had become so deeply ingrained that nothing less than radical intervention could dislodge them. The judgment was surgical, removing the cancer of idolatry that threatened to destroy the patient entirely. This understanding of discipline as expression of love rather than negation of love runs throughout Hosea's message. Come, let us return to the Lord. He has torn us to pieces, but he will heal us. He has injured us, but he will bind up our wounds. The tearing and injuring weren't contradictions of divine love, but manifestations of it. Sometimes love must wound to heal, must tear down to rebuild, must discipline to restore. The waiting period for both Gomer and Israel wasn't open-ended abandonment, but purposeful preparation. Hosea promised Gomer that after many days, restoration would come. God promised Israel that after exile, return would follow. The discipline had limits. The judgment had purpose. The isolation was temporary, a means to an end rather than the final word. What made this discipline an expression of love rather than merely punishment was its goal. Hosea wasn't trying to make Gomer suffer for the sake of suffering. He was creating conditions where genuine transformation could occur, where she could become someone capable of faithful covenant relationship rather than someone doomed to repeat destructive patterns. The restriction on intimacy wasn't rejection but investment in future restoration. Similarly, God's discipline of Israel through exile aimed at transformation rather than destruction. The nation needed to be broken of their idolatry, needed to experience the emptiness of what they had pursued, needed to rediscover hunger for covenant relationship they had taken for granted. The exile would do what centuries of prophetic warnings had failed to accomplish: create desperation that opened hearts to genuine repentance. The discipline also revealed the stubbornness of divine love. A less committed lover would have walked away after such betrayal. A less patient spouse would have moved on to someone else after such humiliation. But Hosea's continued commitment to Gomer's restoration, even at great personal cost and discomfort, demonstrated love that refused to give up, that kept working toward reconciliation even when reconciliation seemed impossible. This stubborn quality of covenant love appears repeatedly in Hosea's oracles. How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? My heart is changed within me. All my compassion is aroused. I will not carry out my fierce anger, nor will I devastate Ephraim again. For I am God, and not a man, the Holy One among you. I will not come against their cities. Even in pronouncing judgment, God's words revealed a heart struggling to maintain discipline against the pull of compassion. The tension between justice and mercy, between necessary discipline and overwhelming love, ran through everything Hosea experienced and proclaimed. His personal story embodied this tension. He had every right to abandon Gomer, yet he bought her back. He had every reason to immediately restore her as wife, yet he imposed a waiting period. Both abandonment and immediate restoration would have been easier than the difficult middle path he chose, the path of disciplined love that pursued restoration through painful but necessary process. For both Hosea and Gomer, the waiting period must have felt endless. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, living in the same house but maintaining distance, sharing meals but not sharing a bed. The children observing this strange new arrangement, wondering what it meant for their family's future. The community watching to see whether the prophet's redemption of his wife would succeed or fail. The discipline required strength from both parties. Hosea had to resist the temptation to either cast her out completely or to restore her prematurely. Gomer had to resist the temptation to return to her former lovers or to resent the restrictions placed on her current situation. Both had to trust that the waiting served a purpose, that the discipline was preparation for something better than what had been lost. This was love that refused to let go, but also refused to pretend that betrayal didn't matter. love that redeemed but also transformed, love that paid the price but also required change, love that pursued but also disciplined, love that was committed to restoration rather than merely to reconciliation, understanding that true restoration required more than just returning to previous patterns. The discipline of love proved harder and more demanding than either judgment or mercy alone would have been. But it was also the only path to genuine restoration, the only way to rebuild what had been so thoroughly broken. As the waiting period continued, both Hosea and Gomer were being prepared for a future together that would be built on a foundation stronger than their first attempt, forged through fire and refined through discipline. The restoration process was painful, but the alternative, permanent separation or superficial reunion, would have been far worse. Love that lasts must sometimes wound to heal. Love that lasts must sometimes wound to heal. And the words Hosea spoke during this period cut like surgical instruments, precise and painful but aimed at restoration. His oracles weren't merely predictions of coming disaster or theological lectures about covenant violation. They were the cries of a wounded heart that understood divine pain from the inside, messages forged in the furnace of personal betrayal and tempered by the discipline of stubborn love. The warnings came first, stark and uncompromising. Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. There is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. There is only cursing, lying and murder, stealing and adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Hosea's words didn't dance around uncomfortable truths or soften accusations with diplomatic language. He named the sins plainly, cataloging Israel's covenant violations with the precision of a prosecutor building an airtight case. The imagery he used was visceral, drawn from agricultural life his audience understood intimately. They sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. The stalk has no head. It will produce no flower. Were it to yield grain, foreigners would swallow it up. The metaphors spoke to farmers who depended on successful harvests. Israel's spiritual unfaithfulness would produce nothing of value, and even if it did, foreign invaders would consume it all. The connection between covenant violation and material disaster couldn't have been clearer. Hosea's oracles specifically named the threat gathering on the horizon. Set the trumpet to your lips. An eagle is over the house of the Lord because the people have broken my covenant and rebelled against my law. The eagle was Assyria, the superpower whose armies were already sweeping across the region, whose reputation for brutality preceded them, whose appetite for conquest seemed insatiable. What looked like ordinary geopolitical maneuvering to Israel's leaders, Hosea identified as divine judgment taking concrete historical form. The prophet detailed what Assyrian invasion would mean. Samaria's king will be destroyed, swept away like a twig on the surface of the waters. The high places of wickedness will be destroyed. It is the sin of Israel. Thorns and thistles will grow up and cover their altars. The capital city would fall. The shrines where Israel had prostituted themselves to other gods would be demolished. The very sites of their unfaithfulness would become ruins overgrown with weeds, silent testimony to the consequences of broken covenant. But Hosea's warnings weren't delivered with satisfaction or smugness. They carried the weight of genuine grief. The sorrow of someone who understood the coming destruction would claim people he knew. Children who had played in streets he walked. Families who had shared his community. My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I also reject you as my priests. Because you have ignored the law of your God, I also will ignore your children. The judgment wasn't arbitrary divine cruelty, but natural consequence of choices Israel had made repeatedly despite endless warnings. Woven through the warnings came urgent calls to repentance, pleas for Israel to turn back before it was too late. Come, let us return to the Lord. He has torn us to pieces, but he will heal us. He has injured us, but he will bind up our wounds. After 2 days he will revive us. On the 3rd day he will restore us, that we may live in his presence. Even while pronouncing judgment, Hosea pointed toward the path of escape, the possibility that genuine repentance might yet avert complete disaster. The calls to return weren't vague spiritual sentiments, but concrete demands for changed behavior. Sow righteousness for yourselves, reap the fruit of unfailing love, and break up your unplowed ground. For it is time to seek the Lord until he comes and showers his righteousness on you. Agricultural metaphors again, speaking to people who understood that you reap what you sow, that fields don't produce without proper preparation, that timing matters in farming as in faithfulness. Hosea called for the destruction of the very things Israel trusted in besides God. Ephraim is like a dove, easily deceived and senseless, now calling to Egypt, now turning to Assyria. The political maneuvering that seemed wise to Israel's leaders was revealed as foolish panic, seeking security from sources that couldn't deliver. When they go, I will throw my net over them. I will pull them down like the birds in the sky. When I hear them flocking together, I will catch them. The alliances they pursued would become traps rather than salvation. The oracles indicted not just the common people, but especially the leaders who had led them astray. The priests do not ask, "Where is the Lord?" Those who deal with the law do not know me. The leaders rebelled against me. The prophets prophesied by Baal, following worthless idols. Religious authorities who should have maintained covenant faithfulness had instead facilitated covenant violation. They would bear special responsibility for the nation's destruction. Yet, remarkably, threaded through all the warnings and judgments came promises of future restoration that seemed to contradict the very disasters Hosea was predicting. Afterward, the Israelites will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come trembling to the Lord and to his blessings in the last days. Beyond the coming exile, beyond the judgment, beyond what looked like the end of Israel's story, Hosea saw another chapter. A return and restoration that defied all logic. The promises grew more specific and more beautiful. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord. The marriage metaphor that had described Israel's adultery now described their future restoration. God would marry them again, would make new covenant that corrected what the first had lacked, would establish relationship on foundations that couldn't be shaken. The restoration imagery painted a picture of complete reversal of judgment. In that day I will respond, declares the Lord. I will respond to the skies, and they will respond to the earth. And the earth will respond to the grain, the new wine, and the olive oil, and they will respond to Jezreel. The curse on fertility would be lifted. The land would flourish again. Even the name Jezreel, which meant God scatters and spoke of judgment, would take on new meaning as God plants, speaking of restoration. Most remarkably, the terrible names of Hosea's children would be reversed in the restoration. I will plant her for myself in the land. I will show my love to the one I called not my loved one. I will say to those called not my people, you are my people, and they will say, you are my God. Lo Ruhamah would become Ruhamah, loved. Lo Ami would become Ami, my people. The judgment encoded in those names wasn't God's final word. Beyond discipline lay restoration, beyond scattering lay planting, beyond rejection lay acceptance. The tension between judgment and mercy ran through every oracle Hosea delivered. He couldn't speak of coming destruction without also glimpsing future restoration. He couldn't pronounce covenant dissolution without also foreseeing covenant renewal. The harsh words of warning were bracketed, by promises of hope that seemed to contradict them, creating a theological tension that reflected the internal struggle Hosea knew God was experiencing. This tension reached its peak in what may be the most emotionally powerful passage Hosea ever spoke. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. But the more they were called, the more they went away from me. It was I who taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by the arms, but they did not realize it was I who healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with ties of love. How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? My heart is changed within me. All my compassion is aroused. These words captured divine love in crisis, torn between justice that demanded judgment and mercy that yearned for restoration. God spoke like a parent watching a beloved child destroy themselves, like a spouse watching a cherished partner throw away everything for worthless substitutes. The pain was real, the struggle was genuine, and the conclusion, when it came, revealed which side of the tension would ultimately prevail. I will not carry out my fierce anger, nor will I devastate Ephraim again. For I am God and not a man, the Holy One among you. I will not come against their cities. Human anger burns out in destruction. Divine anger burns toward purification. Human love has limits. Divine love exceeds all boundaries. The judgment would come, yes, but judgment wasn't the final word. Beyond exile lay return. Beyond death lay resurrection. Beyond the flood of wrath lay the rainbow of covenant renewed. Hosea's oracles during this period gave Israel every warning they needed and every hope they could want. The words of fire described coming judgment with enough specificity that no one could claim surprise. The words of hope promised future restoration with enough beauty that despair couldn't be the final response. Together they revealed a God who judged because he loved, who disciplined because he refused to give up, whose anger was real but temporary while his covenant faithfulness endured forever. The words had been spoken. Now history would determine whether Israel would hear them in time. The words had been spoken, and now history moved with terrible inevitability toward their fulfillment. Everything Hosea had warned about, all the disasters he had predicted through years of prophetic ministry, all the judgments encoded in his children's names and embodied in his painful marriage, came crashing down on Israel with the full weight of divine decree wrapped in Assyrian military might. The northern kingdom's final years unfolded exactly as the prophet had foreseen. Political chaos reigned as kings rose and fell through assassination and coup. Pekah, who had ruled for 20 years, was murdered by Hosea, son of Elah, who would become Israel's last king. The name was cruelly ironic, nearly identical to the prophet Hosea's own name, yet this royal Hosea would preside over the nation's destruction rather than its salvation. King Hosea initially submitted to Assyrian dominance, paying tribute to keep the empire at bay. But vassalage chafed. The annual payments drained resources. The loss of sovereignty stung national pride, so Hosea did what desperate rulers have always done when facing overwhelming power. He sought alliance with another superpower, sending envoys to Egypt with promises of loyalty in exchange for military backing against Assyria. The decision was disastrous. Shalmaneser V, king of Assyria, discovered the conspiracy. His response was swift and brutal. In 725 BCE, Assyrian forces swept into Israel, and King Hosea found himself imprisoned, paying the price for his diplomatic gamble. But Shalmaneser wasn't satisfied with merely punishing the king. He wanted to eliminate the problem of Israelite rebellion permanently. The Assyrian army laid siege to Samaria, Israel's capital city. The fortified city sat on a hill naturally defensible, supplied by springs that provided water even during extended siege. Its walls had been built to withstand attack. Its defenders fought with the desperation of people who knew what Assyrian conquest meant for the vanquished. They held out for 3 years, a remarkable feat of endurance and courage. But courage couldn't overcome the mathematics of siege warfare. Food supplies dwindled, disease spread through crowded conditions. Hope eroded as month after month passed with no relief force coming, no Egyptian army arriving to honor alliance promises, no miraculous deliverance like those recorded in Israel's ancient stories. The city that had been the northern kingdom's proud capital slowly starved and weakened under Assyrian pressure. In 722 BCE, Samaria finally fell. By this time, Shalmaneser had died and been succeeded by Sargon II, but Assyrian policy remained unchanged. The new king recorded the victory in his annals with typical Assyrian precision and pride. "I besieged and conquered Samaria, led away as booty 27,290 inhabitants of it." The number was specific, calculated, a bureaucratic accounting of human tragedy. 27,290 people. Not just a statistic, but individuals with names and families, children and parents, hopes and histories. These were the descendants of Jacob who had received promises of land and blessing. The inheritors of covenant who had repeatedly violated its terms. The audience for Hosea's prophecies who had largely dismissed his warnings as exaggeration. The Assyrian deportation policy was deliberate and systematic. They didn't simply conquer and occupy. They uprooted entire populations and scattered them across their vast empire, from Mesopotamia to Media, from the heart of Assyrian territory to its distant frontiers. The goal was to destroy national identity, to prevent rebellion by eliminating the cultural cohesion that made resistance possible. Deported peoples were settled among foreigners, intermarrying with local populations, gradually losing their distinctive identity until they ceased to exist as a separate people. This was precisely what Hosea's son's name Jezreel had prophesied. God scatters. The scattering wasn't metaphorical or partial, it was literal and comprehensive. The northern kingdom of Israel ceased to exist. The 10 tribes were dispersed across the Assyrian Empire, and most would never return. They became known in later tradition as the Lost Tribes, populations that vanished into the general Near Eastern population. Their tribal identities dissolved. Their covenant relationship with Yahweh functionally terminated. Meanwhile, Assyria repopulated the conquered territory with foreign peoples from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim. These transplanted populations brought their own gods and religious practices, mixing them with whatever remained of Israelite worship. The resulting hybrid culture and religion would eventually produce the Samaritans, a people despised by Jews in later centuries as mongrels, neither fully pagan nor properly Israelite. Everything Hosea had warned about came to pass with horrifying accuracy. The high places were destroyed exactly as prophesied. The shrines where Israel had prostituted themselves to Baal lay in ruins, their altars broken, their sacred poles cut down, their temple prostitutes scattered or killed. The political alliances that seemed so wise to Israel's leaders proved worthless, with Egypt unable or unwilling to intervene as promised. The prosperity that had been attributed to Baal vanished overnight, revealing that it had come from Yahweh all along and could be withdrawn when covenant was violated. The prophecy encoded in Hosea's children's names found complete fulfillment. Jezreel, God scatters, came true as the population was dispersed across Assyria's empire. Lo Ruhamah, not loved, was fulfilled as God withdrew his protective mercy and allowed judgment to fall. Lo Ami, not my people, became reality as the covenant relationship was severed and Israel was handed over to foreign domination and eventual cultural extinction. For Hosea, watching these events unfold must have brought complex emotions. There's a terrible vindication in being proven right about disasters you warned against, but it's a vindication no true prophet wants. Hosea hadn't prophesied because he enjoyed predicting doom. He had warned because he desperately hoped Israel would repent and avoid the judgment. Now, seeing the Assyrian armies, watching the deportations, witnessing the destruction of the kingdom he had loved enough to endure personal humiliation for, he must have felt profound grief mixed with the bitter satisfaction of prophetic accuracy. His message was vindicated, but at what cost? The people who had mocked him as alarmist, who had dismissed his warnings as exaggeration, who had pointed to his failed marriage as proof he couldn't be trusted, now understood too late that he had been telling the truth all along. The scandal of his marriage to Gomer, which had seemed like disqualifying personal failure, was revealed as prophetic wisdom. He had embodied in his own life exactly what would happen to the nation: pursuit of other lovers leading to slavery and dispersion. The religious leaders who had attacked Hosea's credibility now paid the ultimate price for their false teaching. The priests who had facilitated Baal worship were killed or deported. The prophets who had prophesied smooth things and false hope were proven tragically wrong. The political leaders who had trusted in Egyptian alliances and Assyrian appeasement discovered that only covenant faithfulness could have saved them, and by the time they learned this lesson, it was too late to apply it. The fall of Israel demonstrated something fundamental about how God works in history. Divine patience, while extensive, isn't infinite. Warnings, while repeated, eventually cease. Mercy, while abundant, can be exhausted through persistent rejection. The prophetic word, once spoken, will be fulfilled regardless of whether people believe it. What seems like mere human geopolitics, kingdoms rising and falling through military strength and diplomatic maneuvering, can be divine judgment working itself out through historical processes. The Assyrian conquest also validated the prophetic understanding of covenant curses. Deuteronomy had clearly outlined what would happen if Israel violated covenant: foreign invasion, military defeat, deportation from the land, and scattering among the nations. These weren't arbitrary punishments, but natural consequences of breaking relationship with the God who had given them the land and protected them as a nation. By abandoning Yahweh, Israel forfeited the divine protection that had been their only real security in a dangerous world. For the southern kingdom of Judah, watching Israel's fall provided a powerful object lesson. They saw firsthand what covenant violation produced, witnessed the Assyrian brutality that awaited those who rebelled, and hopefully learned that the prophets had been telling the truth all along. Some in Judah did learn. King Hezekiah would undertake reforms and Jerusalem would survive Assyrian siege through miraculous intervention. But many didn't learn, and Judah would eventually follow Israel into exile, though by Babylonian rather than Assyrian hands. The northern kingdom's destruction marked the end of a national experiment that had lasted just over 2 centuries. From Jeroboam's rebellion against Rehoboam in 930 BCE to Samaria's fall in 722 BCE, Israel had existed as an independent kingdom for barely 208 years. Throughout that entire period, not one of their 20 kings had been faithful to covenant. The pattern established by Jeroboam's golden calves had continued unbroken until Assyria ended it permanently. The vindication of Hosea's message was complete. Every warning had come true. Every threat had been fulfilled. The marriage that had seemed like prophetic failure was revealed as prophetic genius. The personal suffering that had seemed meaningless was shown to be deeply significant. The message that had been rejected was proven absolutely accurate. But this vindication brought no joy to the prophet who had loved his nation enough to embody its pain in his own broken marriage and his children's terrible names. Israel had fallen, and with its fall, an entire chapter of redemptive history closed in tragedy. Israel had fallen, an entire chapter of redemptive history closing in tragedy. Yet the story Hosea lived, and the words he spoke refused to die with the kingdom they addressed. The prophet's message, forged in personal anguish and validated by historical catastrophe, echoed forward through centuries, shaping how millions would understand divine love, human betrayal, and the scandal of grace that pursues the unfaithful with relentless determination. The book of Hosea survived when the northern kingdom didn't. Somehow, perhaps through refugees fleeing to Judah before Samaria fell. Perhaps through scribes who recognized prophetic truth worth preserving. Hosea's oracles were written down, copied, and transmitted to future generations. The very survival of his words testified to their enduring significance. This wasn't just historical record of one nation's failure, but timeless revelation about the nature of covenant relationship between God and humanity. Hosea's central metaphor, marriage as the framework for understanding divine-human relationship, became foundational for how later generations conceived of their connection to God. Before Hosea, covenant language emphasized legal terms, treaty obligations, and contractual arrangements. Hosea didn't abandon this framework but enriched it with intimate, emotional dimensions that transformed abstract theology into lived reality. God wasn't merely a sovereign demanding obedience, but a husband whose heart could be broken by unfaithfulness, whose love persisted despite betrayal, whose anger burned hot precisely because his affection ran deep. This personalization of divine emotion proved revolutionary. It challenged conceptions of God as distant, unmoved, untouched by human actions. Hosea's message declared that covenant violations hurt God, that human unfaithfulness caused divine pain, that the relationship between creator and creation involved genuine emotional engagement rather than mere juridical arrangement. The God who spoke through Hosea experienced jealousy, grief, anger, and wounded love, not as divine weaknesses but as authentic responses to relationship honored or violated. Later prophets built on Hosea's foundation. Jeremiah explicitly used marriage imagery to describe Judah's relationship with Yahweh, portraying Jerusalem as an unfaithful wife whose prostitution exceeded even her sister Samaria's. Ezekiel developed the metaphor in graphic detail, describing Israel and Judah as sisters who became prostitutes. Their unfaithfulness depicted in terms shocking even by prophetic standards. Isaiah spoke of God as husband to Israel, declaring that though she was temporarily abandoned, divine love would reclaim her. The marriage metaphor Hosea pioneered became standard prophetic vocabulary. But Hosea's influence extended far beyond prophetic literature. When the New Testament writers sought language to describe the relationship between Christ and the church, they reached for Hosea's marriage imagery. Paul's letter to the Ephesians presents Christ as bridegroom and the church as bride, their union reflecting the mystery of divine love that gives itself completely for the beloved. The book of Revelation culminates in the wedding supper of the Lamb, where redeemed humanity is finally and fully united with their divine spouse. These weren't new metaphors, but fulfillments of the pattern Hosea had established centuries earlier. Jesus himself drew on Hosea's message, though often subtly. When confronted about eating with tax collectors and sinners, Jesus quoted from Hosea, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." The statement came from Hosea chapter 6, where the prophet had contrasted empty religious ritual with genuine covenant loyalty. Jesus applied it to justify his pursuit of the unfaithful, his willingness to associate with those whose lives embodied covenant violation. Like Hosea marrying Gomer, Jesus ate with sinners, not to endorse their behavior, but to demonstrate the scandalous grace of God who pursues rather than abandons the lost. The entire gospel narrative echoes Hosea's story arc. God in Christ entered into union with unfaithful humanity. paid an enormous price to redeem those who had prostituted themselves to other loves, endured the pain of betrayal and rejection, and ultimately offered restoration rather than destruction. The cross itself can be read as Hosea's redemption scene on cosmic scale, the innocent spouse paying the full price to buy back the guilty partner, bearing the cost of reconciliation personally rather than demanding the unfaithful one bear it. Hosea's message about the children's names finding reversal and restoration also found New Testament fulfillment. Peter, writing to early Christians scattered throughout Asia Minor, explicitly referenced Hosea's prophecy. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Lo Ami became Ami. Lo Ruhama became Ruhama. The rejection encoded in judgment gave way to acceptance expressed in grace. What seemed like final words of divorce became the prelude to remarriage on better terms. The scandal of Hosea's message remains as challenging today as when first delivered. Grace that pursues the unfaithful offends sensibilities shaped by merit and justice. We instinctively believe people should get what they deserve, that consequences should match choices, that betrayal should result in abandonment. Hosea's story, like the gospel that builds on it, subverts these expectations by revealing a God whose love operates by different mathematics, who pays prices the guilty should bear, who offers restoration to those who deserve rejection. This scandal created problems for Hosea in his own time and continues creating discomfort today. The objection raised against the prophet that marrying a prostitute compromised his moral authority mirrors objections raised against grace itself. If God simply forgives the unfaithful, doesn't that cheapen faithfulness? If redemption is offered regardless of desert, why bother with obedience? If love persists despite betrayal, doesn't that enable continuing unfaithfulness? These questions troubled ancient audiences and trouble modern ones, revealing how deeply unsettling genuine grace remains to human sensibilities. Yet Hosea's answer, lived in his own marriage and proclaimed in his oracles, doesn't minimize sin but reveals its full cost. Grace isn't cheap because someone pays the price. Redemption isn't automatic because it requires the Redeemer's suffering. Restoration isn't quick because it involves discipline and transformation. The love Hosea demonstrated toward Gomer and that God demonstrates toward humanity doesn't overlook unfaithfulness but absorbs its consequences, bears its pain, and works patiently toward genuine change rather than superficial reconciliation. What Hosea teaches about love challenges romantic sentiments and religious platitudes alike. Real love, covenant love, isn't primarily feeling but commitment that persists when feelings fail. It's choice made daily to honor promises regardless of whether the other party honors theirs. It's willingness to pay prices you shouldn't have to pay, to bear costs that rightly belong to others, to invest in relationship even when return on investment looks impossible. This kind of love is rare, difficult, and costly, which is why Hosea's embodiment of it remains so powerful. About betrayal, Hosea teaches that unfaithfulness destroys more than we imagine when we engage in it. Israel thought they could worship multiple gods without consequence, could pursue political alliances without losing covenant relationship, could attribute divine blessings to false sources without offending their true provider. They were catastrophically wrong. Betrayal has costs that compound over time, consequences that extend beyond immediate circumstances, and effects that ripple through generations. The damage can be repaired, but only through painful process that would have been far better to avoid. About redemption, Hosea teaches that it's possible but never simple. Gomer could be bought back, but buying her back wasn't the same as restoring the marriage. Israel could be redeemed from exile, but redemption required transformation, not just geographical return. The process involves discipline that feels like punishment, waiting that feels like rejection, and purification that requires giving up the very things we've wrongly loved. Redemption is costly for both parties, the Redeemer who pays the price and the redeemed who must change. For modern readers, Hosea's message speaks with surprising relevance. We live in an age of fractured relationships, of commitments easily made and quickly broken, of love conceived as feeling rather than covenant. We inhabit a culture where faithfulness seems naive, where pragmatic self-interest trumps loyalty, where permanent commitment appears optional. Into this context, Hosea's story speaks of love that lasts beyond betrayal, commitment that survives unfaithfulness, and covenant that can be renewed even after catastrophic violation. The book also addresses our relationship with God in contemporary terms. Like ancient Israel, we easily attribute blessings to wrong sources, seeking security in wealth or power or achievement rather than in divine providence. We mix worship of the true God with devotion to lesser gods that promise more immediate satisfaction. We maintain religious forms while abandoning covenant substance. We expect blessing while pursuing unfaithfulness. Hosea's warnings about consequences remain relevant because human patterns of covenant violation remain remarkably consistent across millennia. Perhaps most importantly, Hosea reminds us that God's character doesn't change with changing times. The divine love that pursued unfaithful Israel through judgment and exile still pursues unfaithful humanity today. The covenant commitment that couldn't abandon Israel despite every reason to do so still refuses to abandon those who bear God's name. The grace that paid redemption prices in ancient marketplaces still pays them on contemporary crosses. The promise of restoration that extended beyond Assyrian conquest extends beyond whatever disasters we face or create through our own unfaithfulness. Hosea's children grew up bearing names of judgment that would one day be reversed. His marriage survived betrayal to become testament to covenant love. His prophecies, validated by historical catastrophe, pointed beyond destruction to restoration. His personal pain became window into divine heart, and his message, forged in tears and vindicated by events, continues echoing through time, reminding every generation that love willing to pursue the unfaithful, to redeem the unworthy, and to restore the broken remains the most powerful force in the universe. The prophet who married a prostitute showed us something about God that no amount of theological abstraction could convey. That the divine heart can be broken by human betrayal, and that broken hearts which refuse to stop loving can accomplish redemption that transforms both lover and beloved into something neither could become alone.